Marvel's master of multiversal magic. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction, so please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story and all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter, and if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 26: George, Luna, Colin, and Ginny. The history of the basilisk is too ancient. It has long been forbidden by the Ministry of Magic to breed, so it's rarely mentioned in books, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Like the snorkel, wizards don't believe such magical creatures exist, but my father was fortunate enough to see one once in Sweden, the girl replied, tilting her head. What is a snorkel? Colin asked, his face full of curiosity. The girl explained, it's a magical creature with a special long horn but can't fly. Okay, then it must be a horned beast. By this time, George already knew the girl's identity, Luna Lovegood. Her father was Xenophilius Lovegood, editor of the magazine The Quibbler, and her mother was Pandora Lovegood, who died in an accident while conducting spell experiments when she was 9. Clearly, without sufficient theoretical foundation in magic, creating new spells was a very dangerous thing. Because of her family's extensive knowledge, Luna's story about the owl might be true, but regarding the snorkel, he knew it was something Xenophilius made up to amuse his daughter. The so-called snorkel was actually a horned beast, whose special horn posed a risk of exploding. There's still a seat here. Let me put your luggage on the shelf for you. Wanting to learn more from Luna about things not found in books, George offered to help her move the luggage from the cart to the overhead shelf. Thank you, my name is Luna Lovegood. Luna was also interested in the eagle owl, so she didn't refuse. She was just amazed to see the slender George lift her luggage so easily to the high shelf. You're really strong. After Luna sat down, the three of them started chatting again. Colin, like a curious child, was the one asking questions, Luna was answering, and George was listening quietly, only asking questions when he encountered something that interested him. Whoosh, a long whistle sounded, and the train was about to depart. At that moment, the sliding door of the compartment suddenly opened, and a girl with thick, fiery red hair, bright brown eyes, and a face as delicate and lovely as a doll walked in. Is this seat taken? She asked, pointing to the seat next to Luna. Everywhere else is full. No, you can sit next to me. Luna smiled gently. The girl visibly relaxed, because her brother's forgetfulness, of course, she wouldn't admit that she almost forgot the magic notebook, had caused her to be among the last to board the train. Ginny, we're here to help you. At that moment, a pair of identical red-haired twin boys walked in. They giggled and helped their sister put away her luggage, then playfully chased her away after she gave them a disapproving shoo away. Hello everyone, my name is Ginny, Ginny Weasley. After getting rid of her two troublesome brothers, Ginny sat next to Luna and introduced herself confidently. She wasn't shy at all, except in front of Harry. Luna Lovegood, Colin Creevey, George, the three of them also introduced themselves. George, you have the same name as my brother, one of those two. He's also called George, George Weasley. By the way, what's your last name? Just call me George. George smiled, not explaining further. Although his George and George Weasley's George sounded the same, they were fundamentally different. George Weasley's last name was Weasley, and his given name was George, while his was actually Joe, the Joe of governing. His father hoped he would become an official and govern a region, hence the name. So, according to the local custom, he should actually be called Joe. But he felt it sounded too awkward, so he simply told people to call him George. Ginny, how many brothers do you have? At this moment, the kind-hearted Colin suddenly changed the subject. He figured that as an orphan, George probably didn't want people to know his last name. Ginny didn't think much of it and held up 4 fingers. 6. Bill's a spellbreaker in Gringotts, Egypt. Charlie's a dragon tamer in Romania. Percy's in 6th grade. George and Fred are in 4th, and you just saw Ron. So many. Colin and Luna were surprised by Ginny's answer. So many children, it's rare even for Muggle families, let alone wizarding families. George, listening to their conversation, looked away from Ginny's suitcase and sighed inwardly. If all wizarding families were as prolific as the Wheeleyes, wizards would probably rule the world long ago, leaving no room for Muggles. As the four chatted, the train started moving, leaving King's Cross Station and speeding along fields of cattle and sheep towards Scotland. It was their first time leaving home for such a long trip, and to the famous Hogwarts. Even the quietest Luna was excited. So their conversation never stopped. Because much of their conversation turned to their childhood experiences and family situations rather than magic, George gradually withdrew from the conversation and began reading. Around 12:30, a smiling witch with dimples pushed open the door of the compartment and asked, "My dear children, would you like to buy some snacks from the cart? We have Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, super bubble gum, chocolate frogs, pumpkin pie, crucible cakes, and licorice wands." Faced with a cart full of magical snacks and the witch's question, the three shook their heads simultaneously. Colin, being from a Muggle family, naturally didn't have much money. All his remaining funds had been spent on a magical camera. Ginny, although born into a pure-blood family, had her father expelled from the family long ago for his association with Muggles and his fondness for Muggle items. All the family's expenses came from her father's salary from the Ministry of Magic. With so many children in school, and her brother's defense against the dark arts textbooks being particularly expensive this year, even many of her school supplies were second-hand. Where would she get pocket money for snacks? As for Luna, she didn't lack pocket money, but she didn't seem to have much of a liking for snacks. "One of each, please." Knowing the situation of the young wizards, George got up and spent 12 silver shikots and 5 bronze knuckles to buy one of each snack, placing them on the table. "Ginny, you just mentioned you know a spell called the Bat Spirit Curse. Could you teach me if you have time?" He pushed a quarter of the snacks towards Ginny, whose eyes lit up and she nodded, "Of course. That's my best spell, even George and Fred have fallen for it." "Luna, I'd like to ask you some questions about magical creatures." George pushed another quarter of the snacks towards Luna. Luna smiled and nodded, not refusing. Finally, George tossed aside his own portion and pushed the remaining quarter towards Colin. "Could you take a magical photo of me sometime? I want to keep it as a souvenir." Chapter 27. To be honest, you look like my dad. The train will arrive at Hogwarts in 5 minutes. Please leave your luggage on the train, we will take it to the school for you. Night had fallen outside the window, with mountains and forests stretching out under a deep purple sky. The train was gradually slowing down, and a loud announcement suddenly rang out in the aisle. "We need to change into our school uniforms." George took off his coat and put on the black Hogwarts wizarding robes. Luna, Ginny, and Colin also realized what was happening and quickly changed into their uniforms. After the train stopped, the young wizards rushed out, pushing and shoving in the aisle, afraid of missing something if they were a step behind. Some of the young wizards' faces were even distorted from the jostling. "Don't rush." Seeing this, George decisively stopped Ginny and the other two who were trying to squeeze in. They had already arrived at the station. Hogwarts was such a large castle, they couldn't run away. There was no need to panic and squeeze out. Unlike the other young wizards, he was also curious and expectant about Hogwarts, but he wasn't nervous or flustered. On one hand, he wasn't really a child. On the other hand, having experienced time travel, rebirth, soul splitting, and escape and battle, his heart was much calmer than that of a normal adult. About 2 minutes later, the number of young wizards in the aisle began to decrease, and George led the 3 children out of the compartment, leisurely approaching the car door. "Follow me, don't go over to the older students' side, George. To be honest, sometimes you remind me of my dad, a very reliable feeling," Ginny said, following behind George. "Yet, even more reliable than my dad," thinking of her father Arthur's sometimes unreliable behavior, she added. Colin and Luna nodded in agreement. Although they had only spent less than a day together, George had already left them with a very reliable impression. He spoke calmly, rarely showing surprise, helped them with their luggage, wiped their faces when they got dirty from snacking, and even got up to cover them with wizard robes when they were sleepy in the afternoon. Even getting off the car gave them a feeling of safety, as long as they listened to him. George smiled at this. His actions were simply the subconscious reactions of adults to children, especially those they didn't dislike. His body in this world was that of a child, but forcing him to remain a child was difficult. Therefore, he felt it was unnecessary. Given his background in this world, being precocious was normal and not a bad thing. First-year students. First-year students, this way. Just then, a familiar voice rang out. George turned to see Hagrid, the hunting ground guard, standing on one side of the station with his magic lantern, shouting loudly. Even with hundreds of students at the station, Hagrid's 3 or 4 meter height made him stand out, impossible to miss. "Stay close to me," he instructed, turning back to give the order. George pierced through the dense crowd like a sharp knife, easily pushing aside the older wizards blocking his way, and quickly reached Hagrid's side. In terms of strength, even a 7th-year wizard was far inferior to him. "We meet again, little boss," Hagrid immediately bowed and greeted George. He vividly remembered the young wizard shopkeeper who lived in Nocturne Alley and sold him potions at a discount. "Hello, Hagrid," George nodded with a smile. "You know Hagrid? Why does he call you little boss?" Ginny asked curiously, whispering in George's ear. She hadn't met Hagrid, but her brother Ron often mentioned him, so she guessed his identity. "My adoptive father ran a potion shop. He passed away unexpectedly a while ago, and Hagrid came to buy potions," George replied casually. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked. I hope you're not sad." Hearing George's words, Ginny's expression immediately turned guilty, and Luna and Colin beside her also looked sympathetic. "It's all right," George smiled. He really wanted to say that he had personally killed the old man, but he knew that would scare the 3 little ones. After spending some time with Hagrid, the first-year wizards quickly gathered, about 30 in total. In reality, Hogwarts doesn't have many students, usually around 300, with about 40 students per year. Sometimes there are 40-something, sometimes 30-something. This makes sense, considering the limited number of teachers. For example, defense against the dark arts is taught in all 7 years, but only one teacher teaches it. If there were too many students, it would be impossible to teach them all. Once everyone had arrived, Hagrid led them through a narrow path to the Black Lake. As usual, they were divided into groups of 4 and boarded boats to the castle, a traditional ceremony for first-year students. The purpose seemed to be to commemorate the 4 legendary wizards who founded Hogwarts. Most of the students sat together because they knew each other from the train. George, naturally, shared a boat with Luna, Ginny, and Colin. However, these weren't ordinary boats. They were specially enchanted with alchemical spells, requiring no oars and automatically generating wind to propel them forward. To be honest, the journey from the Black Lake to Hogwarts Castle by boat was quite awe-inspiring. Even George, looking up at the towering castle reaching into the clouds, couldn't help but sigh. One of the young wizards, so overwhelmed with shock, accidentally fell into the lake halfway there. But no harm was done. As soon as he fell in, a giant octopus rescued him and put him back on the boat. Don't underestimate this Black Lake. It's home to many magical creatures. After crossing the Black Lake and disembarking at the castle's underground dock, they followed a tunnel through the rocky cliffs to the castle gates. Hagrid handed them over to a tall, dark-haired witch in an emerald green robe. This witch was none other than Minerva McGonagall, the Transfiguration Professor and head of Gryffindor. "Welcome to Hogwarts. The sorting ceremony is about to begin, but before you take your seats in the Great Hall, you must first determine which house you will be joining," Professor McGonagall said, leading them to a small room on the left side of the Great Hall on the first floor of the castle. She gave them a brief introduction to the 4 houses and the very important House Cup. After Professor McGonagall left, the young wizards began to buzz with discussion, naturally about the sorting ceremony. George was no exception, as he too was contemplating which house he would be sorted into. He wasn't Harry Potter, the sorting hat wouldn't waste time for him, nor would it assign him to whichever house he wanted. He would be assigned, like other young wizards, based on his magical abilities. But it didn't really matter. In his view, all houses were the same, each with its own advantages. Because no matter which house he went to, he would be the most outstanding and brilliant. From this day forward, Hogwarts would welcome its most powerful and gifted wizarding genius in history, George. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 28: The Birth of the King of Scrolls. Is George's body in this world considered genius? Not really. His memory and comprehension are actually quite average. However, his body in the Marvel Universe, having inherited Professor X's genes, truly excels in memory and comprehension. If that were all, he wouldn't be confident of becoming the most talented and gifted student in Hogwarts history. His confidence stems from 2 main points. First, he doesn't only have one brain, he only has one will. But now, With his proficient control of two bodies, he can essentially operate two brains simultaneously for memorization, analysis, and comprehension. For example, when his Harry Potter clone sees a calculation problem, it might take 20 seconds to mentally solve it using only the clone. But if he simultaneously awakens his main body in the main world and joins the calculation, with both brains working together, he can probably solve it mentally in less than 10 seconds. Similarly, when researching and learning magic, learning with two brains simultaneously is far superior to learning with only one, making him comparable to some top geniuses. To this end, he even changed the main world's sleep schedule. In the future, his clone would attend classes during the day, while his main body would act as a second brain in the Marvel world at night to assist in improving learning efficiency, and then catch up on sleep during the day. Secondly, in the days before school started, he did something else. He used the supercomputer in the basement of the Mutant Academy to input all the books and textbooks he had read in the Harry Potter world into the computer. He didn't plan to miss any of the knowledge points from later classes or the books in the school library. With two brains running simultaneously, he became a top genius, but he still couldn't have a photographic memory. Not to mention him, even the top wizards and legendary wizards in the wizarding world couldn't remember every word in every book they had read. But now it's different. All the content has been input into the supercomputer, and he can immediately access the relevant information by searching for keywords. As for security issues, not to mention that the supercomputer is independent and not connected to the internet, even if it were leaked, it wouldn't be usable without wizarding blood, and normal people would just think those magic books were utter nonsense. So in the following lessons, if he couldn't remember the answers to any of the teacher's questions, he could use the supercomputer to quickly find the answers and get all the points. In exams, anything involving theoretical knowledge was no different from an open book exam for the next 7 years. He would undoubtedly be among the school's top students. Why do he do this? Of course, it was to obtain more resources and better magic. Only by being sufficiently excellent could he have more privileges. If Hermione hadn't been excellent enough, how could she have obtained the Time Turner? If Voldemort hadn't been excellent enough, how could he have gained the admiration of so many wizards, the favor of his teachers, and learned so much powerful dark magic? Therefore, he too had to be excellent in every aspect. Even if this might make Dumbledore think he was like Voldemort, it wouldn't matter. Given Dumbledore's personality, as long as he didn't commit crimes, even if he resembled Voldemort, he would at most be more vigilant and monitored. But wouldn't nip him in the bud? Besides, speaking of resembling Voldemort, how many of Slytherin's top students weren't like Voldemort? How do you think they can accurately sort us into which house? It can't be through some kind of test, can it? I've only read a lot of magical history, nothing else. Colin's expression showed a hint of unease. As a young wizard born into a Muggle family, he basically had no magical foundation. If it was a test, he really wouldn't know anything. Ron told me it was a terrible test, but I don't believe it. Why would a school do something dangerous to its students? If it were, I don't think Ron would pass. Ginny looked indifferent to any test, considering herself much stronger than her timid brother Ron. Luna remained nonchalant. Dad didn't tell me the specifics of the sorting process, but he said it was very simple, and we'd be assigned to the house that best suited us, so don't worry. Oh, that's good. Which houses are you all going to? Colin breathed a sigh of relief, then became excited. I want to go to Gryffindor. Harry Potter is from Gryffindor, and it's said that the greatest wizard, Dumbledore, is also from Gryffindor. Me too. My brothers are all from Gryffindor, Ginny replied, her face slightly flushed. Actually, the more important reason was that her favorite character, Harry Potter, was from Gryffindor. Either is fine, Luna and George said simultaneously. Just then, a scream suddenly came from the hut. It turned out that a group of ghosts had appeared through the walls, startling the young wizards. The ghosts chuckled and commented on the young wizards, then scattered and disappeared upon seeing Professor McGonagall. Now, line up in a single file and follow me, Professor McGonagall said seriously, then led the young wizards out of the hut and towards the Great Hall on the other side of the hall. It's truly magnificent. As the group entered the Great Hall, George's eyes lit up. The first thing that caught his eye was the thousands upon thousands of magical candles floating in midair, followed by the magnificent virtual starry sky on the ceiling, created by magic. Below, 4 long seats, each representing a house, were filled with wizards in their 6 years. On the tables were gleaming gold plates and goblets. Directly opposite, another long table was set up, occupied by the school's teachers. The oldest and most prominent figure in the center was undoubtedly Dumbledore, flanked by Flitwick, Sprout, Lockhart, and others. However, he didn't see Professor Snape, the head of Slytherin. After a moment's thought, he remembered that the professor should be patrolling the castle, apprehending Harry and Ron, who had already made the news. Because Dobby, the Malfoy house elf, feared the dangers posed by Voldemort's diary during Harry's visit to Hogwarts, he had closed the entrance when Harry and Ron entered Station 9 3/4. The two missed the Hogwarts Express and had to take Arthur's privately modified magical cart to Hogwarts. However, Ron's driving skills were lacking, and he forgot to become invisible during takeoff, resulting in the car being witnessed by many muggles and a spectacular display of flight, an event even made it into the Daily Prophet. At this point, they were probably already at the school, but had missed the sorting ceremony. Looking around the windows of the Great Hall, he spotted two boys peering inside, only to be quickly pulled away by a large hand. Poor little brats, a moment of silence for you. Harry and Ron were caught red-handed by Snape, and things were likely going to get very bad. Because Lily was Harry's mother, Snape would protect Harry even at the cost of his own life. But because James was Harry's father, Snape also genuinely disliked Harry. Chapter 29 Sorting Ceremony. In front of the long table on the platform was a four-legged stool, upon which rested a patched, clearly antique pointed wizard's hat. The hat was singing to itself until Professor McGonagall approached. "Whoever's name I call, put on the hat, sit on the stool, and await your sorting." Professor McGonagall produced a parchment scroll. Colin Creevey. Colin froze, then scurried forward, nervously sitting down and putting on the hat. Almost without pause, the hat gave its answer, Gryffindor. All the wizards at the Gryffindor table erupted in applause, celebrating the addition of a new student to their house. Astoria Greengrass, Slytherin. Luna Lovegood, Ravenclaw. Ginny Weasley, Gryffindor. As each young wizard was called, it was soon George's turn. George. The moment George put on the sorting hat, like the other young wizards, there was no hesitation or questioning from the sorting hat. The answer was immediate. Slytherin. Slytherin. A look of surprise crossed George's face, but he quickly composed himself, put down the sorting hat, and leisurely walked to the Slytherin table and sat down. To be honest, he thought he was most likely a Gryffindor, with a small chance of being a Ravenclaw, but he hadn't expected Slytherin. However, upon reflection, he realized that he preferred to be methodical and had clear goals, and was sometimes quite realistic, which did align with some of the characteristics of Slytherins. Perhaps, deep down, he really did lean more towards the Slytherin personality traits. Slytherin didn't mean bad, none of the four houses represented absolute good or absolute evil. Gryffindor has produced wizards like Pettigrew, and Slytherin has had wizards like Regulus who sacrificed himself to fight Voldemort, even preferring death to having a house elf take his place. The characteristics of the four houses are largely positive. Gryffindor is brave, Ravenclaw is learned, Hufflepuff is upright, and Slytherin is intelligent, ambitious, and goal-oriented. Slytherin is also good. Snape is quite protective of his own and is proficient in dark arts. If he can win honor for Slytherin, it should be quite rewarding. Coming to his senses, the sorting ceremony was over. Actually, beforehand, he had analyzed the personality of each head of house he might be assigned to and made corresponding plans. Therefore, even Slytherin wasn't a major problem. Dumbledore briefly introduced the new defense against the dark arts professor, Gilderoy Lockhart, and then announced the start of the banquet. Then, countless delicacies prepared by house elves instantly appeared on the four long tables, and the hungry young wizards immediately began to show off. George also began to eat the food on the table, but he still kept some attention on the long table in front of him. Sure enough, not long after, a wizard with a thin, sallow complexion, a hooked nose, and greasy black hair cascading over his shoulders, wearing a black robe and cloak, and exuding a cold aura, appeared at the entrance of the Great Hall. He strode to the long table like a large bat, and every young wizard he passed, regardless of their house or year, involuntarily held their breath. This man was none other than Severus Snape, the head of Slytherin, the top potions master, and a magical expert second only to Dumbledore, Voldemort, and Grindelwald. Snape exchanged a few words with Dumbledore and McGonagall, and Professor McGonagall's expression quickly turned ugly. Then the three of them walked out of the Great Hall together. "My dad got promoted again at the Ministry of Magic. My mom bought me a sword worth 20 galleons when I was 7, HMPH, What's that compared to what I have? At the Slytherin table, the first-year wizards ate while boasting about their families and wealth. Most of the wizards assigned to Slytherin were purebloods, with very few being half-bloods, and almost none born into pure Muggle families. Therefore, some knew each other from childhood. Even those who didn't know each other would deliberately display their family background and wealth to secure their future status. George didn't join in. His body was most likely that of a half-blood. His Muggle mother had a relationship with his wizard father, resulting in an unplanned pregnancy. Unable to find the father, she didn't want to be a burden, so abandoning the child was quite normal. Therefore, in terms of family status, he was definitely at the bottom of Slytherin, and there was no need for him to suffer. As a half-blood, as long as he demonstrated absolute power like Snape and Voldemort, he wouldn't lack status and admirers. Slytherin values bloodline, but even more so strength. Of course, you have to be at least half-blood. Oh, Merlin's beard, that's Bloody Barlow. He looks terrifying. Just then, the young wizards shuddered as a gaunt, vacant-eyed, blood-covered ghost suddenly sat down at the Slytherin table. He sat right next to George. George glanced up at Bloody Barlow, a faint smile appearing on his face. He nodded elegantly to Bloody Barlow as a greeting, then continued eating his dinner at a leisurely pace. So what if he was covered in blood? He'd seen it all in the lab, killed dozens of people. Why would he be afraid of a little blood? Bloody Barlow was clearly surprised that a first-year wizard could be so calm upon first meeting him. However, as a Slytherin ghost, he was quite pleased that Slytherin had such a courageous young wizard, so he nodded in return. Which family is he from? How dare he greet Barrow the Bloody? I don't know, never heard of him. He must be a half-blood. A half-blood? But he doesn't look like one. I think he's more like a wizard from one of the 28 families. He looks very refined. George's behavior towards Barrow the Bloody naturally caught the attention of all the Slytherin wizards. They were curious about this elegant yet bold young wizard. However, they quickly concluded that George was a half-blood, because if he were pure-blooded, they wouldn't have never heard of him, and his name, George, was also strange. Even so, some of the young wizards developed a liking for George. Chapter 30: A Show of Force. Draco, he's much better than you were last year. At the Slytherin table, a short-haired witch teased the blonde boy sitting opposite her at the second-year table. The boy's expression immediately soured. What's he? Just a half-blood. Let me tell you, I'm going to be the Seeker this year and help Slytherin win the House Cup. Last year, Barrow the Bloody sat next to him, scaring him half to death and becoming a major stain on his life. Draco, are you really going to join the team? Hearing the news that Draco was going to join the team, the young wizard's attention was immediately drawn. Quidditch is a sport that almost no wizard dislikes, and the annual Quidditch match is always a highly anticipated event. Of course. My skills are far superior to that idiot Potter's. He just got lucky, Malfoy said proudly. In reality, his father had sold a lot of things in Nocturne Alley and used the money to upgrade the entire Slytherin Quidditch team with the latest Nimbus 2001s, which was why he had this opportunity. As the banquet drew to a close, Dumbledore, Snape, and McGonagall returned. Dumbledore gave some instructions, and the opening banquet concluded with everyone singing the school song. First years, follow me. At this moment, the fifth-year prefects at the four long tables almost simultaneously rose. The first-year students from the four houses also rose and followed their respective prefects to their dormitories. Leaving the Great Hall and arriving at the first-floor hall, the four houses separated. The Gryffindor and Ravenclaw wizards ascended the marble staircase to the upper levels of the castle, while the Slytherin and Hufflepuff wizards went to the lower levels. Slytherin's dormitories were located even further down than Hufflepuff's. Let me tell you, of the four dormitories in the school, ours in Slytherin is the best. Because from your dormitories and common rooms, you can see directly into the underwater world of the Black Lake, and the magical creatures that live there. The fifth-year prefect, walking ahead, noticed the Slytherin wizard's slightly troubled expressions due to the cold darkness of the basement, and immediately proudly introduced the dormitories. Hearing that they could see the magical creatures beneath the Black Lake from their dormitories, the wizards' faces lit up with surprise. They vividly remembered the giant octopus that had saved them when they crossed the Black Lake by boat. Purebred, reaching a wall at the far end of the basement, the prefect shouted a password, and the wall immediately split open, revealing a large room shrouded in greenery, the Slytherin Common Room. The password for the Common Room changes every 2 weeks, and the new password will be posted on the bulletin board. the prefect explained as he led the wizards into the common room. At this moment, the wizard's attention was completely captivated by the sights inside. The ornate decorations, the exquisitely carved furniture, and the beautiful view of the Black Lake through the transparent glass instantly dispelled the gloom of the dungeon. Most magical of all was a medieval tapestry hanging there, depicting various famous adventures of the Slytherins of that time. It was like watching a grand movie, with the characters occasionally greeting and exchanging a few words. "Look, a mermaid. A mermaid just swam by. Alright, you'll see these things often in the future, don't be too surprised. Now, I suggest you go to your respective dormitories and settle in. Boys on the left, girls on the right. Your names are posted on the doors, check in according to your names." The prefect waved his hand with satisfaction, gave a few final instructions, and left. "It's like living in an aquarium." George glanced around the common room, then, instead of continuing the tour with the other young wizards, turned and walked towards the boys' dormitories. He quickly found his name on a room door, along with 3 other names, meaning he had 3 roommates. Baron Belanta, Ivy Thorn, Kaiser Burke. Doesn't seem to be a famous family. He glanced at them but didn't pay them any mind, pushing open the door and entering the dormitory. Like the common room, the dormitory also had many transparent glass windows, offering a clear view of the lakebed outside. "Looks like you haven't gone hungry either." On the bedside table closest to the door, George saw Paige happily feasting in her cage. Clearly, the house elves responsible for transporting the luggage hadn't neglected the young wizard's pets, preparing a sumptuous dinner as well. Coo, Paige responded happily upon seeing George, then continued her work. After quickly unpacking his luggage, George sat on the soft bed and began reading a spellbook. Actually, his diligent study of magic wasn't just for self-defense, it was also because he genuinely loved magic. To think that something that only existed in his illusions in his previous life was now truly before him, and that he could wield this magical power, how could he not be captivated? Honestly, in all his years in his past life, nothing had ever captivated him so completely. If it weren't for the fact that his body needed sufficient sleep to better learn magic, he could even forego sleep altogether, dedicating himself to studying and learning this wondrous power of magic 24 hours a day. Sometimes he'd even thought that this kind of life might be the life he truly wanted, instead of going to get off work like a robot every day, wearing a mask to entertain superiors, colleagues, and clients, only to slowly age and become a handful of ashes to be buried in a cemetery by his descendants. Looking back on his life, there wasn't a single thing worth cherishing. That lowly mermaid dared to scare me through the glass. Once I learn powerful dark magic, I'll definitely make her taste my power. Of course, we are the noblest wizards, pure-blooded at that, and will surely become prominent figures in the wizarding world. About half an hour later, the 3 young wizards chattered as they entered the dormitory. When they saw George and the enormous Paige beside him, they were startled. Even they rarely saw an owl as big as Paige. Their pet owl was only slightly larger than their palm. "Hey kid, are you George Joe?" "Call me George, or Joe," George replied without looking up. The 3 exchanged glances, and the largest-looking young wizard raised his head and said, "I like your bed. Now take your luggage and go to the innermost bed." Their fathers all worked at the Ministry of Magic and had known each other since childhood. After discovering that the last person in the dormitory was a half-blood who had made a splash at the banquet, they decided to come in and teach him a lesson. So they didn't actually like George's bed, they just wanted to give him a hard time and let him know that they were the main characters in this dormitory, or rather, in first year Slytherin. Chapter 31 A Little Knowledge of Martial Arts. George closed his spellbook, looking at the 3 with amusement. "Well, I'm sorry, but I quite like this bed and don't want to give it up. You seem to be unaware of the situation." The 3 young wizards stepped forward simultaneously, their faces threatening. "You should know that while the school forbids magical attacks, it doesn't say we can't use our fists." In their eyes, George was much taller and thinner than them, and besides, there were 3 of them, while George was alone. If George didn't understand the situation, they wouldn't mind teaching him a lesson. As far as I know, the Slytherin tradition is that whoever is more capable is the leader. If you are better than me in your studies and get better grades, then I'm willing to give up my bed. What do you think? George suggested with a smile. If possible, he still didn't want to beat up the children. After all, he was now a proper wizard. And the most important thing for a wizard was elegance. Rolling up one's sleeves and beating people was something only warriors did. What is he saying? He means that he, a half-blood, We'll get better grades than the three of us purebloods? That's the funniest joke I've ever heard. The lead wizard burst into laughter, followed by the other two. I'm ordering you right now, take your luggage and its stupid pet, and get to the innermost bed, or you'll regret it. Fine, since you're unwilling to compete academically, I'll show you some fighting skills. Seeing his three new roommates' lack of self-awareness, George placed his spellbook beside his bed, then stood up and stretched his limbs. Without magic or abilities, relying solely on pure physical strength, at his current level, he could easily beat not only the three in front of him, but even an entire first-year wizarding class to tears. It wasn't that he had particularly superior fighting skills, it was simply that his strength and speed far surpassed these wizards. Looks like you really need a lesson. Seeing George stand up, the three wizards said nothing more, rolled up their wizard robes, and pounced on him. 2 minutes later, George gracefully sat down again, picked up his magic book, and said while reading, I advise you not to think about going to the teacher or the prefect to complain. Otherwise, the three of you ganged up on me and ended up like this. If word gets out, your next 7 years will be, we know, you shouldn't be so smug. You're just a little stronger. If you're so capable, let's compete in grades and magic later. The three little wizards, lying on the ground with the bruises and tear stains, changed their expressions immediately upon hearing this, and then stammered in response. They had actually considered going to the teacher to complain and have George severely punished, but now they thought that if they did that, they might really become the laughingstock of the whole school. So they could only use the excuse of competing in grades to save face a little. I just said we'd compete in grades, but you insisted on competing in fists. Sigh. George shook his head, and the three little wizards' faces became even uglier, clearly very regretful. The next day, early morning. While the three little wizards with the bruises were still fast asleep, George, who had slept for 7 hours, opened his eyes on time. After a quick wash, he went to the common room. The prefect had mentioned yesterday that the week's schedule would be posted there after 6 a.m. It was 7:20 a.m. now, and the junior wizards' regular classes started at 9 a.m., so most were still asleep. Only a few particularly diligent older wizards were reviewing their lessons in the common room. They were probably fifth-year wizards, as they were taking the crucial ordinary wizarding level exams this year. Only one class today. Finding the posted schedule, George discovered that on the first day of school, Slytherin first years only had a history of magic class at 2 p.m., the rest of the time was free. However, looking further down, it wasn't all that easy. Tuesdays had 2 transfiguration classes in the morning and 1 defense against the dark arts class in the afternoon. Wednesdays had 2 herbalism classes in the morning and a break in the afternoon. Thursdays had transfiguration and defense against the dark arts in the morning, charms in the afternoon, and a history of magic class in the evening. Fridays had 2 potions classes in the morning, herbalism in the afternoon, and astronomy in the evening. It was also noted that flying class would begin in the second week, scheduled after charms on Thursday afternoons. The timetable also listed the house name for each class. Because of limited teaching resources and small student populations, at Hogwarts, classes were typically shared between 2 houses, with over 20 students in one classroom. Potions and flying were shared with first-year Gryffindor students. Charms and transfiguration were with Hufflepuff. Herbology, history of magic, defense against the dark arts, and astronomy were with Ravenclaw. The timetable also indicated the classroom locations for each subject. There are so few charms classes, George frowned after memorizing the entire timetable. For him, charms was the most important subject, as it taught most magical principles and basic spells. However, the timetable only showed 1 charms class a week, like the seemingly useless astronomy class. But upon reflection, it made sense. It was the first year, and many students came from Muggle families. For children completely unfamiliar with magic, mastering so many spells wasn't urgent, building a solid foundation was more important. Looks like I'll have to rely on myself. This level of instruction is far too little for him. To master more magic, he'll need to dedicate more time to self-study. Fortunately, unlike Nocturne Alley, self-study at Hogwarts is far more efficient because he can ask teachers any questions he doesn't understand, and he can also consult a vast collection of free magic books in the library. Since I don't have class until the afternoon, I'll spend the morning exploring. George stopped reading and began wandering around Hogwarts Castle. He'd be studying here for the next 7 years, so he needed to familiarize himself with every place beforehand to make things easier later, and it was also a good opportunity to get acquainted with his classrooms. Leaving the Slytherin common room, he first explored the entire dungeon. Don't underestimate the dungeon. The area beneath Hogwarts Castle is enormous, winding and complex. Just a rough tour took him almost an hour. The houseboat, the dungeon storage room, the room where ghosts often gathered for death anniversary parties, the potions classroom, the Slytherin headmaster's office, the 5th underground classroom, the Hogwarts kitchen, and the Hufflepuff dormitory. The kitchen door was closed. Only the sounds of house elves jingling and preparing breakfast with magic could be heard inside. A large pile of barrels stood outside the Hufflepuff dormitory, requiring specific knocking to enter, so he didn't go inside. Instead, he went up to the first floor hall to have breakfast. Chapter 32 Everyone here is useless. George, long time no see. Just as George reached the first floor, he heard a shout from above. Turning around, he saw Harry, Hermione, and Ron coming down the marble stairs. Good morning, Harry, Hermione, and this. Hello, my name is Ron. Harry said you helped him escape from Nocturne Alley last time. That was so cool. Ron's tone was excited. That was the infamous Nocturne Alley, a place his two twin brothers dreamed of exploring. Nothing's as cool as you and Harry, driving a magical car from London to school, making the Daily Prophet's page, and even crashing the Whomping Willow, Hermione sarcastically remarked. Ron's face stiffened immediately. Okay, can you please stop lecturing us? We don't want that. He realized that Hermione was sometimes a miniature version of Professor McGonagall, always saying she liked to lecture them, but in reality, she was often braver than them. Harry stepped forward, avoiding Ron and Hermione's argument, and asked George, we missed the sorting ceremony yesterday. Which house did you get sorted into? Slytherin. George pulled out the Slytherin badge he'd received yesterday, which he hadn't yet pinned to his chest. Harry's face fell. I wish you'd been sorted into Gryffindor. Deep down, he still harbored some prejudice against Slytherin, especially with the Malfoys and their ilk, and Snape, whom he disliked the most. George smiled. Any house is fine, as long as I'm at Hogwarts, I'll be happy. Good morning, George, a voice called from above again, this time coming down the marble stairs. Ginny, Colin, and Luna. You know each other? Harry and Ron were taken aback when Ginny greeted George. We shared a compartment on the train yesterday, and George took good care of us. Ginny's voice immediately softened when she saw Harry, and her movements became more ladylike. Thank you for taking care of Ginny. Ron, whose attitude had initially changed somewhat upon hearing that George had been sorted into Slytherin, regained his positive impression of George and even expressed his gratitude. Compared to Harry, his prejudice against Slytherin was actually deeper. Before coming to Hogwarts, he had once believed that all bad wizards came from Slytherin. Could you please take a picture of me and Mr. Harry Potter? Colin handed the camera to Ron, his eyes sparkling as he looked at Harry. My name is Colin. I want to take a picture with you to send to my dad, to prove that I met you. He's a milkman, and there's no one else in my family besides me. Ron reluctantly took the camera. When he first met Harry, he hadn't behaved much better than Colin, so it was understandable. After taking the picture, the group walked and chatted as they arrived at the Great Hall. Many young wizards were already eating breakfast in the Great Hall, and the 4 long tables were piled high with various foods prepared by house elves, pumpkin porridge, pickled herring, bread, eggs, and fresh meat, among other things. Different houses generally don't eat breakfast together, so George went to the Slytherin table, Luna to the Ravenclaw table, and Harry, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, and Colin to the Gryffindor table. First-year student, you seem to know Harry Potter and the others. George had just sat down when the blonde Malfoy, with his 2 henchmen Goyle and Crabbe, sat opposite him. Because of Pansy's teasing yesterday, he remembered George, and seeing George chatting happily with Harry, whom he disliked the most, immediately annoyed him. We're friends, George replied casually, taking a bowl of pumpkin porridge and a plate of fresh meat. He already knew that getting close to Harry would inevitably offend Malfoy. In fact, even without getting close to Harry, he would still offend Malfoy. Because he wanted to become the best student in all of Hogwarts, and even join the Quidditch team, he would definitely steal Malfoy's thunder. But it didn't matter, little Malfoy wasn't his father, the elder Malfoy, and posed no threat to him. Friends? Slytherin and Gryffindor are enemies, they can never be friends. You'd better stay away from them, or I'll teach you a lesson on how to become a Slytherin wizard. Malfoy was clearly dissatisfied with George's attitude, his tone full of warning. George replied calmly, "It's my freedom to make friends with whomever I want, you'd better mind your own business. I heard that last year's top scorer was Hermione from Gryffindor, and we Slytherin lost a house cup, which we'd held for 6 years. You guys are really useless." He deliberately raised his voice when he said the last sentence, so much so that even the wizards at the other tables looked over. "What did you say? You actually called me useless? What right do you, a half-blood, have to call me useless?" Malfoy was furious when he heard George's words, slamming his hand on the table, causing the mountain of bread on it to collapse. George put down his spoon and looked up at Malfoy. "As far as I know, our Slytherin head of house is also a half-blood. Are you discriminating against our head of house? The head of house is naturally different from you." "I was just referring to you." Malfoy's tone immediately softened. "It's normal for purebloods to discriminate against half-bloods, but this kind of thing can't be said openly, because there are quite a few half-bloods among the upperclassmen of Slytherin, including the head of house." He had just been confused by anger. "A mere first-year student, yet you have such a big mouth. We Slytherin compete on strength, not eloquence." At this moment, Pansy, who was sitting near the second years, walked over. Although she had teased Malfoy yesterday, it didn't mean she wasn't on his side. The Malfoy family was a prestigious family among purebloods, and she might very well marry Malfoy in the future, elevating her family's status even further. So seeing Malfoy get the short end of the stick, she naturally wanted to help. "This young lady is right. Our Slytherin excellence is based on merit. So I'm not targeting him personally, I'm saying all of you second-year students are utterly useless." George gracefully wiped his mouth and stood up, speaking loudly in a tone that left countless young wizards speechless. "If you weren't useless, how could our 6-year winning streak of the House Cup have been ended here? George, we'll say it right now, with me here, first place will always belong to Slytherin, and I will win the House Cup back from Gryffindor. But I'm not like you useless students. I won't turn against students from other houses because of this healthy competition. Competition is competition, and friendship is friendship, whether it's Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, or Hufflepuff. I will make the friends I should make, and I will win honor for Slytherin with honor and strength. That's the spirit that Slytherin should have." Chapter 33 Hogwarts Castle. Putting down the tissue and ignoring Malfoy and the others, George turned and walked straight out of the Great Hall. Applause began to rise in the classroom, and then, whether out of a desire to stir up trouble or simply to make things worse, the applause grew louder and louder. It wasn't just the upperclassmen from Slytherin, wizards from the other 3 houses also applauded. While the upperclassmen naturally bore some responsibility for losing the House Cup last year, George's statement shifted all the blame to the second years, a point that was hard for the upperclassmen not to agree with. As for the wizards from the other 3 houses, Slytherin was already rather disliked, and seeing them fight amongst themselves was something they were naturally happy to do, their applause adding fuel to the fire. However, a small group of more naive young wizards watched George's retreating figure with stars in their eyes, genuinely applauding. George, of course, knew this. Whether sincere or feigned, at least his purpose had been achieved. "Harry, to be honest, I was totally charmed just now. Even though he's Slytherin and said he was going to steal our House Cup, I didn't find him annoying at all. Especially since you saw Malfoy's face, even when we won the House Cup last year, he wasn't that bad looking," Ron couldn't help but say to Harry at the Gryffindor table. He actually disliked Malfoy more than Harry, especially after his father and Malfoy's father had a fight in Diagon Alley. Harry nodded in agreement. "George is different from Malfoy, but we can't lose the House Cup. Like George said, we're having healthy competition, let's all work together." Hermione, no longer angry about Harry and Ron's dangerous behavior yesterday, had returned to her usual self. "We'll do our best." Ginny and Colin looked at Harry expectantly, seemingly waiting for his reply. Harry encouraged them somewhat helplessly. "Go for it, I think those 2 could start a Harry Potter fan club right away," Ron couldn't help but tease. In contrast to the jubilation on one side, Malfoy's face was so dark it seemed to drip water. The louder the applause in the Great Hall, the more swollen his face felt. He knew the upperclassmen of Slytherin were still resentful about losing the Quidditch and House Cups last year, but hadn't said much because of his family and status. Indeed, Slytherin had won for 6 consecutive years before them, proving that the 6 years above Slytherin were stronger than the other 3 houses. Last year, they lost to Gryffindor, largely due to Hermione and Harry, who were in the same year as him. As the representative of his year's Slytherin, he naturally had to bear the blame. If he could surpass Hermione's grades, surpass Harry's in Quidditch, and earn more points, even if Harry and the others scored significantly more points, they wouldn't have lost. "We must win the House Cup back, not by him, but by me, Malfoy. Don't worry, he's just a joke. Time will prove your Slytherin's hope." Pansy, though also looking grim, wasn't worried at all. Because unless George is exceptionally outstanding, even if his grades are decent, it wouldn't justify his previous statement. The outcome was already predetermined. "There's nothing I can do, you walked right into this mess." After leaving the Great Hall, George continued exploring the first floor. As a Slytherin without family backing, to quickly gain fame and attention, one must be sharp and unassuming, not hide their talents. As for whether this would make Dumbledore think of Voldemort, it's unlikely. He hasn't shown any dislike for Muggle wizards and has openly acknowledged his friendship with Harry, Ron, Hermione, and others. So Malfoy's provocation actually provides an opportunity for him to clarify his stance and establish this persona, otherwise, he wouldn't be able to say it so openly. In fact, if it weren't for this, he could have simply ignored Malfoy's provocation. After all, the other party couldn't do anything to him. Besides the Great Hall and the sorting ceremony waiting room he had previously stayed in, the first floor also has many other rooms. For example, there's a staff lounge specifically for house teachers, Filch's office, a transfiguration classroom, and some other temporary classrooms. After touring the first floor, he ascended the marble staircase to the second floor. The second floor primarily housed his afternoon classes in the History of Magic classroom, the Gryffindor headmaster's office, and the school infirmary, managed by Poppy Pomfrey, a specialist in healing magic. There was also a girls' restroom. The third floor was most important, containing the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor's office and Moaning Myrtle's restroom, which led to the Slytherin Chamber of Secrets. George didn't go in, only observing from the outside. The fourth floor contained Charms classrooms, Defense Against the Dark Arts classrooms, a prize display room, and the Armor Gallery. The Armor Gallery contained many amulets. He even witnessed two armors fighting, apparently because one armor singing was so awful that the other couldn't take it anymore. He was very interested in this kind of magic that could awaken sentience in inanimate objects. If used in a mutant school, it could significantly enhance the school's defenses. There was another important place on the fourth floor, or rather, the most important one for him. That was the Hogwarts Library, boasting tens of thousands of spellbooks and hiding countless forbidden books unavailable elsewhere, closing before 8 p.m. every night. The fifth floor consisted of abandoned classrooms and a shared unisex washroom. The sixth floor also had abandoned classrooms and a washroom for prefects. The seventh floor had some vacant offices and a boys' washroom. The eighth floor contained the Ravenclaw headmaster's office, the entrance to the Gryffindor Tower, the entrance to the divination classroom in the North Tower, the entrance to the Ravenclaw Tower, the entrance to the West Tower, the entrance to the headmaster's office, and the Room of Requirement. George knew how to enter the Room of Requirement, but he didn't go in. In his view, the entire Hogwarts castle was likely under Dumbledore's surveillance, and suddenly entering the Room of Requirement would easily arouse suspicion. Besides, he didn't need the Room of Requirement right now. He also didn't intend to touch the Voldemort Horcruxes hidden inside for the time being. After touring the castle, he explored the surrounding area, including the herbology greenhouses and gardens, the broomstick class practice area, and the Quidditch pitch. Having scouted everything, it was already noon. Instead of venturing further to Hagrid's hut in the Forbidden Forest, he returned to the Great Hall for lunch. This time, he was no longer the invisible figure in the Great Hall. Many young wizards secretly pointed and whispered about him, some admiring, some envious, some disdainful, and some maliciously waiting to see him fail. George didn't care. He also encountered Harry and his friends coming for lunch after class. Hermione showed him the exquisite button she had transformed from Beetles in Transfiguration class. Ron was in a bad mood. Harry told him it was because Ron had received a stern letter from his mother after he left that morning. In the afternoon, George, carrying his History of Magic textbook, began his first class at Hogwarts. Chapter 34, The Arrogant Scholar. George makes his debut. History of Magic was a combined Slytherin and Ravenclaw class, so George soon saw Luna wearing her homemade carrot-shaped earrings upon entering the classroom. However, perhaps due to Luna's somewhat unconventional behavior and way of speaking, None of the Ravenclaw students wanted to sit with her, including her roommates. Similarly, George, because of his morning speech, was also sitting alone. Until his abilities were confirmed, no one wanted to sit with him, lest they become the butt of the joke. As for his 3 roommates, their faces were still swollen, making it even less likely they would sit next to him. "Don't worry about what others think, just be yourself," Luna said calmly, sitting down next to George, her wand tucked behind her ear. George smiled and nodded, "Thank you." Although he didn't need comforting words, Luna's actions still deserve his thanks. In fact, although Luna was a year younger than Harry and the others, her maturity sometimes surpassed that of some adults. She had her own thoughts and beliefs, and even if others thought she was crazy, she didn't care. She never got angry at her classmates who often played pranks on her, always remaining calm and composed. To be honest, George felt he could never have done what Luna did at her age. The school bell rang, and the ghost Binns, the history of magic teacher, passed through the wall above the blackboard and appeared on the podium. He was Hogwarts' only ghost teacher, and had once been the history of magic professor in his lifetime. One day, when he stood up to go to class, he accidentally left his body in an armchair in front of the fireplace in the faculty lounge, thus becoming a ghost and continuing to teach history of magic at Hogwarts. In the Middle Ages, those who didn't know magic were terrified of it, yet lacked sufficient understanding of it. Occasionally, they would capture a real witch or wizard, but burning them was utterly useless. The wizard simply cast a basic fire-condensing spell, feigning pain while enjoying the tingling sensation. The eccentric Gwendolyn loved the feeling of being burned so much that she deliberately disguised herself in various ways, allowing herself to be captured 47 times, without any opening remarks or self-introduction. Professor Binns began recounting the history of magic from the moment he stood on the podium, using his characteristic panting, drawn-out tone. As if casting a hypnotic spell, he quickly lulled some of the young wizards to doze off. After speaking for half an hour, Professor Binns paused slightly, then, following his rigid teaching rhythm, began asking questions. "Can anyone tell me, how many times was the eccentric Gwendolyn captured by Muggles?" Although he asked the question, he didn't expect anyone to actually answer. He knew his lectures all too well. So this was just a necessary part of the lesson. If no one answered, he would continue lecturing until the end of get out of class. 47 times, Professor. However, just as he was about to skip this part and continue, a young wizard raised his hand and gave the answer. "Very good, correct answer." Professor Binns was somewhat surprised, but didn't think much of it and prepared to continue the lesson. Few young wizards could answer his questions. The last time was with a Gryffindor student named Grant or Granny. But this was nothing unusual in his 1,000 years of teaching. No points? It seems just answering the question isn't enough. George raised an eyebrow slightly when he saw that Professor Binns hadn't given him any points for his correct answer. From what he knew, Professor Binns was the only professor who didn't give points, not because he was mean, but mainly because he had a bad memory and couldn't remember to give points. After becoming a ghost, his memory was poor except for historical knowledge. So, to get points from him, simply answering the question correctly wasn't enough. "Professor, I have a question. Since wizards can use various spells to defend against Muggle attacks, why were so many wizards persecuted by Muggles back then?" Because wizards learned magic primarily through inheritance from their parents, and many wizards didn't actually master many spells, so the 4 headmasters founded Hogwarts so that more wizards could learn magic to protect themselves. Right, yes, that's one reason. It seems you have some knowledge of magical history. I just memorized over 40 books of magic during this time, including the history of magic, a history of Hogwarts, important magical events of the 20th century, modern magical history, and an interpretation of medieval events. Are you sure you've memorized so many books on magical history? Professor Binns, unusually surprised, looked at George's words. The other drowsy young wizards also woke up, their faces showing gossip. "Then I'll test you." Next, Professor Binns began asking George questions about the time, place, and general content of various events from the magical history books he had mentioned. George answered fluently and without a single mistake. "Your name is George, right? Very good. It's been a long time since the school has had a student as interested in magical history as you. Your understanding of magical history surpasses that of many 5th and 6th year students." Professor Binns' usually stern face broke into a smile of satisfaction. Other ghosts became ghosts out of fear of death, but he became one because of his dedication to teaching magical history. Nothing could make him happier than to see his students so talented and interested in it. I've always felt that magical history is a very important and worthy subject. Studying magical history allows us to apply the experiences of our wizarding predecessors to our own lives, inspiring wisdom. It not only helps us learn magic and improve spells, but also helps us find ways for wizards to interact, and for wizards and muggles to interact. Even better, we can see the future in history, illuminating our path forward. George spoke his views on history in a loud and clear voice, leaving the Slytherin and Ravenclaw students around him stunned. Although they didn't quite understand George's words, they thought he sounded very impressive. Because at this moment, Professor Bin's ghostly body was actually trembling with excitement. Well said, well said. I'll give you a reward, a reward. Oh, right, I can give you extra points. I forgot, George, you're great, I'll give Slytherin 50 points. Oh, Merlin's beard, Professor Binns actually gave points. Did he say he never gave points? Oh, Merlin's underwear, George actually won 50 points for Slytherin in one go. It seems he wasn't exaggerating this morning. The young wizards erupted in excitement upon hearing that Professor Binns had given points. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 35 George, the point-scoring maniac. With the history of magic concluded, George was no longer alone. He was surrounded by young wizards. Did you really memorize all those spellbooks? Yes, my memory is pretty good. I heard you're going to win the House Cup for Slytherin. Of course, on the way back, facing questions from his fellow Slytherin classmates, George handled them with ease, always displaying confidence without arrogance, quickly becoming one of them. Even his three roommates, whom he had previously beaten up, looked at him with more admiration. That's how Slytherin is. If you're a Slytherin, if you're good enough to bring them honor and benefits, they'll instinctively gather around you. As a first-year student, George achieved an impressive 50 points for Slytherin in his very first class, a source of pride for all first-year students. Of course, if George wanted to truly become a leader in Slytherin, this achievement alone was far from enough. But it was at least a good start. The news that he had earned a 50-point grade for Slytherin from Professor Binns in History of Magic class quickly spread among the young wizards to most of the teachers and students in the school. Normally, it wouldn't have happened so fast, mainly because Professor Binns was notoriously bad at awarding marks, and the buzz surrounding George's earlier comment that morning hadn't died down yet, creating a perfect opportunity. The good thing was that when he sat in the Slytherin common room that evening, older Slytherins would frequently come up to greet him. Even when Malfoy tried to cause him trouble, the prefect stopped him. The next day, both periods in the morning were Transfiguration, which he attended with the first-year Hufflepuffs. As soon as George entered the classroom, he was met with stares from the Hufflepuff young wizards, who had clearly heard about his 50-point achievement for Slytherin the previous day. However, they didn't say anything provocative. Most Hufflepuff young wizards were quite good-natured, simply curious. Meow. Just as the Transfiguration class was about to begin, a tabby cat walked in through the door, and then, to the gasps of the young wizards, transformed into Professor McGonagall, dressed in a dark green robe. Animagus transformation. George's eyes lit up slightly as he saw McGonagall transform from a cat into a human. This was a very advanced transfiguration technique, allowing one to permanently transform into one type of animal. Although it couldn't be a magical creature, and it could only be one, he still found it extremely useful. Because no matter what animal it was, as long as it wasn't too conspicuous, it was an excellent form of camouflage. This camouflage was incredibly useful for gathering intelligence, escaping, and tracking. Imagine you're being chased by a large group of agents, monitored by satellites, and surrounded by countless sniper rifles in the distance, with no way to escape. But if you mastered Animagus transformation, you could easily find a house, enter, and transform into an ordinary creature to hide and escape. If it were a cat, it might arouse some suspicion, but if it were something like a fly, a mosquito, or a ladybug, it would be completely unimpeded. Transfiguration is the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts. Anyone who misbehaves in my class will be asked to leave and never be allowed to return. I have warned you. Professor McGonagall stepped onto the podium, first issuing a stern warning, then easily transforming the lectern into a pig with a wave of her wand, and then back again. The students were all captivated, eager to begin learning this magical art. However, after Professor McGonagall's theoretical explanation, they realized how difficult it was to transform such a large lecture hall into pig. A truly great teacher is indeed different. George, after listening to a theoretical lesson, was filled with mixed emotions. Transfiguration being treated as a separate subject from all other spells indicated that it was far more profound than other forms of magic. Although he had spent time studying it, and even memorized the entire textbook, his history of magic was mainly learned through computer cheating. There were still many things he didn't understand. Even after consulting Twink several times, he still couldn't quite understand her explanations. It was like studying advanced calculus. Even if you memorized the entire book, you might not get a high score. Professor McGonagall, a top transfiguration master with years of teaching experience, helped George gain a significant understanding of transfiguration. Slytherin, 5 points. Before the first lesson ended, there was a Q&A session, and George unsurprisingly earned 5 points. He had a naturally strong memory, especially with notes being taken on a computer. He wrote down everything, from serious knowledge points to even Professor McGonagall's reprimands. Unlike Professor Snape, Professor McGonagall was fair and treated all students equally, not deliberately discouraging George from getting points just because he was a Slytherin. On the contrary, seeing George's perfect answers and his own understanding of transfiguration, a rare smile appeared on her lips. The first lesson was theory, and the second was practice. Professor McGonagall gave each of them a match and asked them to use a basic transfiguration spell to turn it into a needle. This was clearly not easy for the young wizards. They chanted this spell again and again, waving their wands repeatedly, but the match remained a match. Only a few talented young wizards saw some changes in their matches, but they were still far from becoming needles. Don't give up, practice more. Think about the key points I taught you last lesson, the speed and rhythm of the spell, the angle of the wand swing, and most importantly, your hearts. You must firmly believe that you can turn it into a needle. Professor McGonagall walked back and forth in the classroom, constantly correcting the mistakes some young wizards made in casting spells. But when she reached George's desk, her eyes lit up. Slytherin, another 5 points, because she saw a perfect needle. Not only was the tip extremely sharp, but even the thread hole at the end was flawless. Hearing Professor McGonagall's bonus, the young wizards all turned their gaze to George, seeing the perfect needle on his desk, and showing expressions of envy and admiration. George, however, smiled and refrained from uttering any more startling words. In fact, after the first lesson, he had already grasped a key principle of transfiguration, or rather, most of the key principles of spells: the power of the mind, the power of belief. When learning a new spell, the spell and wand are merely aids. Otherwise, no wizard could cast spells silently and without a wand. The most important thing is the mind. The power of the spirit. This is the foundation of magical perfection. It's often said that magic in the Harry Potter world is highly spiritual, and there's some truth to that. He had a significant advantage in this regard, because besides being a wizard, he also possessed the mental strength of a level 2 mutant. Therefore, after learning the theoretical knowledge from Professor McGonagall, he successfully transformed a match into a needle after only a few experiments. Crucially, he felt that his mental strength might extend beyond this. He might not be able to transform a lectern into a pig, but transforming something larger, like the size of a fist, should be achievable now. Chapter 36. Lockhart has 3 good points. After Transfiguration class, he didn't go straight to dinner. Instead, he chased after Professor McGonagall for a full hour, asking her questions about Transfiguration before finally leaving, still feeling unsatisfied. Each professor teaches several grades and is incredibly busy. If he didn't seize the opportunity to ask questions, he might not be able to find the time. In the afternoon, it was Defense Against the Dark Arts class. Gilderoy Lockhart, dressed in a lavender-purple robe, swaggered into the classroom and stood on the podium. I, Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Defense Against the Dark Arts, 5-time winner of the Wizarding Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, but I don't wear that on my sleeve. I don't exorcise the Wraith of Ren with a smile. His supposedly humorous opening left the boys in the classroom exchanging bewildered glances, while the girls were completely won over, clapping enthusiastically. This guy's not bad looking. Looking at the wizard above, whose numerous honors were all earned through deception and trickery, George had to admit that his popularity in the wizarding world, and his adoration by witches of all ages, wasn't just due to his good writing, More importantly, it was his handsome appearance and shameless personality. However, despite lacking real talent, this guy was still quite useful to him. He summarized Lockhart's advantages in 3 ways. First, good for academic credits. As long as you liked his style, he wouldn't hesitate to give you credits like other professors. Second, good for connections. Only professors could grant students permission to access the forbidden section, and if you had a good relationship with him, you could get a pass from Lockhart. Third, good at the forgetfulness charm. This guy was terrible at other spells, but his forgetfulness charm was comparable to top-tier wizards. If he could learn the forgetfulness charm from Lockhart, it would be a great help in the Marvel world. Therefore, he didn't intend to slack off in this class. I see you've all bought my complete set of books. That's great. Let's start with a little quiz today. Don't be afraid, it's just to see how well you read and how much you've understood. Lockhart finished his self-introduction and took out a stack of papers, handing them out to the young wizards in the classroom. You have 30 minutes, now, begin. George picked up a paper, noticing it was full of questions about Lockhart himself, and quickly had Marvel's main body open the computer to look them up. After becoming the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, Lockhart replaced all the Defense Against the Dark Arts textbooks for grades 1 through 7 with his own 7 books. So George naturally bought them too, including the Defense Against the Dark Arts textbook that first-year students had been using, Dark Magic, a guide to self-defense. He had actually read all 7 of Lockhart's books. After all, setting aside the self-aggrandizing content, many of the magical experiences were real experiences of wizards with considerable skill. It's just that Lockhart had plagiarized those experiences and then used his expertise in forgetting spells to make those wizards forget them. Half an hour later, Lockhart collected the papers and began reviewing them on the podium. Most papers had only a few questions answered correctly. Even the little witches who liked him could only answer about half at most. Until he turned to George's paper. "Oh, who is this?" "George, I know you. You said yesterday morning that you wanted to win back the House Cup for Slytherin. Very good, you really are. Not only do you know my favorite color, but you also know my most desired birthday present, and my great and noble ambition. You actually answered all my questions correctly. 20 points, Slytherin plus 20 points. Lockhart's smile never faded as he graded George's paper. In the past 2 days, during his Defense Against the Dark Arts class, apart from a second-year Gryffindor girl named Hermione who answered most of the questions correctly, very few others had more than half. But now, a student had answered all the questions correctly, and this was the very famous Slytherin freshman of the past 2 days. How could this not make his vanity explode? "Professor, I feel that your book contains many magical experiences worth studying in depth, so I have read it repeatedly and it is deeply imprinted in my mind," George said, raising his hand. This clearly pleased Lockhart, who approached George with great satisfaction and laughed heartily. "Don't worry, as long as you work hard, with your magical talent that is almost as good as mine, you will definitely succeed like me one day. I have high hopes for you. Even if I succeed, I still have to thank the professor for his guidance. I have always been a grateful person." George gave a meaningful smile, and Lockhart's eyes lit up, his gaze towards George becoming even more amiable. "Alright, next we will begin reading my book, Wandering with Ghouls. This book contains a lot about ghouls. I will ask questions randomly, and you will get points for correct answers, and so, by the end of Defense Against the Dark Arts class, George had earned another 10 points for Slytherin. So far, in just 2 days, he alone had earned a full 90 points for Slytherin, giving them a significant head start. Similarly, after class, he didn't let Lockhart off the hook. "Professor, I have some questions about magic that I'd like to ask you." "No problem. Since we're the same kind of people, I can spare some of my precious after get-out-of-class time to give you some private lessons." Lockhart didn't refuse, but winked at George. From George's actions yesterday morning and his current behavior, he keenly sensed that the other was just like him, obsessed with fame. However, he didn't dislike George, because George had indicated a mutually beneficial relationship. The more famous George became, the more famous Lockhart would become. More importantly, he himself relied entirely on deception, while this George was clearly genuinely gifted. Such a promising talent, like Harry, could be brought under his wing in advance. "Professor, I'm somewhat interested in the forgetfulness charm. I wonder if you could." Seeing Lockhart agree, George didn't stand on ceremony and went straight to the point. Lockhart was initially a little hesitant, intending to brush George off easily, but upon hearing that the question concerned the obliteration charm, his only proficient spell, he immediately puffed out his chest and replied nonchalantly, "The obliteration charm is my least favorite spell, but it's still a little better than those guys in the Ministry of Magic's Memory Erasure Command." The Ministry of Magic's Memory Erasure Command, under the Department of Magical Accidents and Disasters, primarily handles the erasure of Muggle memories of magic using obliteration charms and the repair of buildings damaged in magical battles using restoration charms. Therefore, the wizards in this department are among the most skilled masters of obliteration and restoration charms in the wizarding world. Chapter 37 The Slytherin Star. Wednesday morning, Herbs class. As expected, George once again scored a perfect 10 for Slytherin. This body, having spent years selling potions with the old wizard, already possessed considerable knowledge of herbs and potions. Combined with the computer assistance of his original body, first-year questions were no challenge for him. In the afternoon, George left the castle alone, walking along a path leading to the Forbidden Forest towards Hagrid's cottage. It was early July, the perfect time of year with neither too hot nor too cold. Wildflowers of all kinds bloomed along the path outside the castle, and the lush green grass stretched all the way to the Black Lake. If one walked a few more steps towards the Black Lake, one might even spot several older wizards entwined on the slope. Children abroad mature earlier, and Hogwarts wizards even more so. Many begin dating in their second or third year. Those like Ron and Harry, whose romances didn't blossom until their fourth or fifth year, were a minority. Without disturbing the young lovers, he continued walking, crossing the Quidditch pitch and a long stone bridge. Finally, at the edge of a vast forest, he saw a wooden cabin 2 or 3 times larger than usual, with giant pumpkins planted in front of it. Woof woof woof, just as he reached the cabin door, a large black dog suddenly jumped out from the side, barking defiantly at him. George stared at the dog, activating his telepathic abilities. The dog paused for a moment, then wagged its tail. Tooth, stop. At that moment, the cabin door was pushed open, revealing Hagrid's massive body. "It's you, little boss. Welcome. I just made some rock cakes. You can have some with this little boy." "That would be an honor." George looked surprised. He hadn't expected Hagrid to have other guests besides him today. "Ginny, what are you doing here? Don't you have class this afternoon?" Entering the cabin, he saw Ginny sitting on a stool taller than himself. As far as he knew, Cryfinder only had Friday afternoons off, and today was Wednesday. "George, you're right, I need to get ready for class." Ginny jumped off the stool in a panic and rushed out of the hut. Hagrid placed the freshly made rock cakes on the table and laughed. "The little girl wanted to ask me when Harry was coming, but you scared her away." "Well, you can finish hers too. Smells so good. It's a pity I just had lunch in the Great Hall before I came." "It's such a shame." George patted his round belly and pushed the rock cakes back with a regretful expression. Hagrid's rock cakes were made to fit his own teeth. They were hard enough to be used as bricks, and he didn't want to break any teeth. Seeing that George's belly was indeed quite round, clearly indicating he had eaten a lot, Hagrid also showed a regretful expression, picked up the rock cakes, and finished them off in a few bites. Next time I'll definitely save my stomach, Hagrid. I'm very interested in magical creatures and have read some books on the subject. I have a few questions I'd like to ask you." George twitched his lips, then stated the purpose of his visit. He could communicate with magical creatures using his telepathic abilities, but that didn't necessarily mean he could tame them for his own use. It just gave him a greater advantage compared to ordinary wizards. Like the Magizoologist Newt Scamander, who was said to be born with the ability to communicate with magical creatures. But Newt was able to tame so many powerful magical creatures mainly because he had a deep understanding of their habits and could treat them accordingly. "You're interested in magical creatures? That's great. I can tell you anything I know." Hagrid, being simple-minded, immediately launched into a long explanation upon hearing that George shared his interest. George listened, while simultaneously taking notes on the other side. Learning about magical creatures was partly to tame powerful magical creatures for his own use, and partly because he valued the resources of the Forbidden Forest. Many rare magical creatures are valuable in their entirety, serving as essential materials for crafting magical items and potions. The Forbidden Forest is home to many of these rare creatures. For example, the venom of the eight-eyed spider is worth 100 galleons per pint, and there are at least 100 eight-eyed spiders in the Forbidden Forest. Speaking of making money, Even the potions masters, who are considered the most lucrative, don't actually earn as much as the master of magical creatures. However, masters of magical creatures mostly cherish magical creatures and don't intentionally exploit them for profit. Furthermore, becoming a master of magical creatures is no easy feat. Without sufficient strength, one can easily be eaten by magical creatures. Newt Scamander is born with the ability to communicate with magical creatures, and Hagrid possesses half-giant blood. It's not just about money. Sometimes, things that money can't buy can be obtained through the exchange of rare magical creatures, symbolizing an important resource for trade. Thursday mornings include transfiguration and defense against the dark arts, afternoons include charms, and evenings include history of magic. George earned Slytherin another 40 points, propelling their score far ahead of the other three houses, proving his earlier boast was no exaggeration. He gradually earned the reputation of Slytherin's star, a rising star in the school. In reality, Slytherin's overall score wasn't weak each year, and with Snape's favoritism, they consistently won the House Cup. However, last year, Hermione's academic prowess significantly boosted their scores. Even with Harry and Ron dragging them down and Snape deducting points, the gap wasn't too large, allowing Dumbledore to capitalize on the Philosopher's Stone incident and achieve a comeback. This year, George was even better at boosting scores than Hermione, not only in other subjects but also in history of magic, without the deductions from Snape. Even with Dumbledore's favoritism, a difference of 100 or 2 points was understandable, but a difference of several hundred points was difficult to recover. Professor Snape, the head of Slytherin, shared the same sentiment. Does anyone know what ingredients are needed for the potion to treat boils? George, your answer. During Friday morning's potions class, George felt slightly embarrassed as he stood up to answer for the 5th time. It's narcissus root powder, aconite, and porcupine quills. Professor, looks like not everyone's a fool. Slytherin, 5 points. Snape glanced around the classroom. All the young wizards except George had their heads down. Now we'll try to make this potion. Hopefully, you won't be so idiots. Following the steps to make the potion, George couldn't help but marvel at how different Snape was from Professor McGonagall. Actually, Snape's questions were a bit beyond the curriculum. Only those like George, who could easily consult their herbal and potion textbooks, could answer them. You could say he was biased, but only George could raise his hand and answer correctly. Even Dumbledore couldn't say anything if things got serious. But George was certain that Snape wanted him to raise his grades, otherwise, he wouldn't have asked him 5 times in one class. He figured Snape would give him more points after he made the potion. Sure enough, when George was the first to make a potion, Snape appeared beside him like a giant bat. Excellent potion, Slytherin plus 5 points. Chapter 38 Choosing an Agent. Over the weekend, George spent most of his time practicing his newly learned spells, occasionally taking time to visit Hagrid to learn about magical creatures and communicate telepathically with Hagrid's pets. He didn't see Harry and Ron during this time, supposedly because they were being punished for his car accident and damaging the Whomping Willow. The following week, he continued his frantic efforts to improve his grades while absorbing as much magical knowledge as possible, learning and practicing new spells. Meanwhile, on the Marvel side, after more than 10 days of investigation, things were gradually becoming clearer. That evening, George rode his modified motorcycle from the mutant school in the suburbs towards the Bronx, closer to the city. At a checkpoint, he used his expensive fake ID to get past the checkpoint. During his investigation over the past 10 days, besides getting a general understanding of dozens of large and small families in the Bronx, he also paid a high price to a local forger to create a fake identity for him. Of course, this fake identity could only fool ordinary police officers. It wouldn't fool the CIA, SHIELD, or the National Bureau of Investigation. Not to mention using this identity to open an account, deposit the money, and then use it to buy Stark shares. Therefore, he never intended to buy Stark shares himself. His body was a product of a laboratory, lacking any form of identification. A fake ID wouldn't work. He needed an agent, but not just anyone. This person needed a certain status and position, otherwise, buying Stark shares for him might arouse suspicion and attract the attention of various organizations. In fact, he felt that even if you robbed all the gangs in the Bronx and used all the cash to buy Stark Industries stock, it would be a drop in the ocean for a behemoth like Stark Industries. After all, he could only plunder cash, at most coercing the bosses to withdraw liquid funds from their accounts. He couldn't take all the gang assets. Perhaps this cash was an astronomical figure in the poorest and most chaotic Bronx, but for Stark Industries, it might not even be worth the artwork in Tony Stark's mansion. The money of the truly wealthy is unimaginable to the poor. A painting in Tony Stark's room might be worth hundreds of millions, but for him, hundreds of millions was more than enough to provide a stable life for his mutant children. He didn't need to get involved in any major conflicts or clash with any major organizations. He just needed a stable life to focus on his magic research and improve his strength. If it weren't for the worry about the Chitauri invasion in a few years, and the possibility of the Avengers' defeat and the fall of the entire Earth, he wouldn't be staying near New York. Secondly, this agent needed to have ties to the Bronx and couldn't leave. Otherwise, with so much money under the agent's management, what if the agent simply absconded with it? He couldn't believe that someone would be loyal to him after only a few months of interaction. He didn't have that kind of domineering spirit. Fortunately, these past 10 days hadn't been wasted. He had gradually developed a potentially feasible goal. Today was a good day to watch a good show. If everything went smoothly, then the agent could be confirmed. He parked his motorcycle, found an empty alley, put on a black robe to cover his body, donned the most common mask that could be bought anywhere, and activated his powers to the fullest. His specially designed shoes with metal plates immediately lifted him up, slowly levitating him above the alley. After this period of development, especially influenced by his wizard bloodline, his control over magnetism had improved considerably, allowing him to barely manipulate objects weighing over 100 pounds. This exceeded the laboratory base's initial assessment of his potential limits. If he were to encounter X-24 now, he could easily toy with it. Over 100 pounds would make even the adamantium-clad X-24 unsteady on its feet. Therefore, at full power, he could barely manage to make his specially designed shoes with metal plates carry him into the air. Of course, the speed was slower than walking. In combat, he would be an easy target. However, it was still very useful in certain situations. For example, right now, he could easily climb onto rooftops and move through the air to avoid various surveillance cameras and lines of sight, easily infiltrating heavily guarded areas without being easily tracked. On the 7th floor rooftop of the strip club controlled by the Chebel family, an elderly man in his 70s sat in a wheelchair, looking at the middle-aged man who had been beaten to the point of near death. He said with some regret, "Leon, you were really good. I truly believed in you and always treated you like a godson. Unfortunately, you must die here today, Mr. Chebel. I truly didn't betray you. I've been wronged. I've always treated you like a father. How could I possibly betray you? You must believe me." The middle-aged man, his face covered in blood, struggled to his feet, desperately trying to prove his loyalty. He was the child of a drug addict. His mother had secretly left him when he was young, unable to bear the hopeless life. At 13, he unexpectedly saved Mr. Chebel, who was being hunted by a rival family. From then on, Mr. Chebel appreciated him and he joined the Chebel family's power, living the life he had always dreamed of. For 30 years, he had used his intelligence and dedication to help the Chebel family grow from a small family to one of the 13 most powerful families in the Bronx. However, he was executed for a mere assassination attempt, accused of being the mastermind behind a plot to seize control of the Chebel's family. He was truly unwilling to accept this. He had a beautiful and loving wife, many brothers who had risked their lives for him, and a lovely newborn daughter. He had dedicated most of his life to this family. "I know you didn't betray me. That assassination attempt was a play I orchestrated myself. Otherwise, given your current status and prestige in the family, I really wouldn't have been able to execute you so easily." Chebel sighed, his eyes filled with complex emotions. Hearing Chebel's words, Leon's eyes widened in disbelief as he murmured, "Why? Why would you do this? I had no choice. I'm old. The doctor said that with my body riddled with injuries, I only have 2 years left to live. But my son is only 20, just taking over the family business. His abilities and reputation are still immature." Chebel coughed, a hint of sadness in his eyes as he looked at Leon. He wasn't without feelings for Leon, but no matter how capable Leon was, or how mediocre his son was, he would never allow Leon to replace his son. "You're worried I'll replace the young master in the future, but you should understand my loyalty to you. I would never do such a thing." Leon slumped to the ground, as if all his strength had been drained. Chebel pushed his wheelchair forward and shook his head. "Leon, I believe in your character, but I don't trust your subordinates. Sometimes, this position isn't something you can simply refuse. Your subordinates will push you into it. Chapter 39 Codename, Death. My final plea, in consideration of all I've done for the family, spare my wife and daughter's lives, and allow my brothers to continue serving the family. Having served the family for so many years, Leon knew that what Chebble said wasn't impossible. His men had indeed always hoped he would become the head of the Chebble family and had repeatedly urged him to change the name to the Leon family. So at this moment, he stopped complaining and simply knelt before Chebble, bowing his head in pleading. However, Chebble cruelly shook his head again. Leon, I once heard a saying from a Chinese man I killed, and I've always found it very true. It's called, if you don't cut the weeds at the root, they'll grow back in the spring. My son can't have any potential threats if he wants to inherit the business I've built. You must understand a father's good intentions. I'm going to kill you. Leon mustered all his strength and suddenly lunged at Chebble, but he was kicked away by the burly man beside Chebble halfway through his attack. He wouldn't have been this weak under normal circumstances, but he was already covered in wounds. Leon, don't struggle anymore. Go in peace. I'll personally take men to deal with your wife and daughter. Maybe you and they'll meet again in heaven. Oh no, people like us definitely go to hell after we die, so we probably won't meet again. The burly man stepped forward, stomped on Leon, and pulled out a pistol, pointing it at his head with a sinister grin. Leon lay on the ground, roaring angrily, Chebble, I regret not listening to my brothers. If there really is a hell, I will crawl out of hell and take you and your son down with me. If there are demons in hell, I'm willing to exchange my soul to break out of hell and take revenge. Unfortunately, there is no hell in this world, nor are there demons. Otherwise, I would have died countless times already. After all, my hands are stained with so much blood. Reality is so cruel. Only people like me can enjoy wealth and glory, and my children will inherit my wealth and glory. Chebble didn't care about Leon's curse at all. He had heard such words far too many times. Just then, an intrigued voice suddenly came from above the water tank on the roof. I am not a demon, nor do I want your soul, but if you are willing to cooperate with me, then I am willing to grant your wish. Everyone turned to look at the top of the water tank, where a mysterious man wearing a death mask and a long robe stood. Where did this guy come from? Kill him. Chebble narrowed his eyes and immediately ordered. The dozen or so men guarding him immediately drew their pistols and aimed them at the mysterious man, ready to kill him on the spot. However, the moment they aimed, their pistols suddenly slipped from their hands, as if controlled by an invisible force, floating in midair and pressing against their foreheads, and the bullets automatically chambered. I advise you not to move, or I can't guarantee the gun won't go off. George walked down from the top of the water tank as if stepping on air, and then came to Leon, who was lying on the ground unable to get up, looking down at him. Your answer, that's right. Leon was the agent he currently considered quite suitable. Once he helps Leon take over the Chebble's family, Leon will become one of the most powerful figures in the Bronx underworld, fully qualified to buy Stark stock without suspicion. Furthermore, if he eliminates the other 12 families, Leon can openly annex them. With such a large territory, Leon wouldn't be able to abscond with his wife and daughters, allowing for a long-term partnership. Later, he could also be of great help in gathering intelligence and dealing with the Akers Corporation's pursuit. He'd always felt Professor X's past actions were unwise. Why separate mutants from humans and give them a new name? Wasn't that just making life difficult for humanity? Anyway, the term mutant has faded from human memory, so let's forget about it completely. They're just humans with special abilities, and naturally, they can cooperate with humans to fight those evil scientists and terrorists. Leon stared at the unbelievable scene on the rooftop for 2 seconds, then replied with unwavering determination, if you can save my family and brothers, then my life is yours. I don't want your life, I just need you to do some things for me in the future. George snapped his fingers, and all the hovering pistols fired simultaneously. Chebble's men fell helplessly to the rooftop. Sir, whatever you need, I can do for you. You don't need to cooperate with a loser. The only survivor, Chebble, seeing all his men killed, broke out in a cold sweat in his wheelchair. He tried to persuade George to spare him. However, George smiled and shook his head. No, you're too old. Having someone like Chebble as an agent would likely mean he'd be dead in 2 or 3 years, requiring a replacement, too much trouble, and his character wasn't as reliable as Leon's. You can handle it yourself. A thin blade flew from George's pocket, easily severing the ropes binding Leon's hands. Leon got up, picked up the pistol from the fallen burly man, went to Chebble, and without giving him a chance to beg for mercy, shot him dead. "Thank you. How should I address you?" Looking at Chebble lying in a pool of blood, Leon was silent for 5 seconds before turning to George and sincerely thanking him. If it weren't for George's intervention, he would be dead today, and his wife, daughter, and brothers who had risked their lives for him would certainly not be alive. So his thanks were genuine. "No need to thank me. I had my reasons for saving you. We're in a cooperative relationship. As for my name, I can't tell you." George touched his mask and waved his hand. The farmer and the snake, the ingratitude, such things are not uncommon. He didn't think that saving someone once would make them loyal to him. Besides, given the other's upbringing and experiences, he couldn't be a good person. "Then I'll call you Death." "What do you need me to do?" Leon asked, looking at George's mask. He was a smart man and understood what George meant. Actually, he wasn't without doubts about George's miraculous methods and his disguise. "Whatever, it's fine now. I'll come find you when I do." George pointed to the iron gate at the rooftop entrance. "Your boss's men should react soon. We need to get out of here." "They're here." Leon's expression changed. He heard a large number of footsteps coming from the rooftop stairwell. His physical condition was poor. Even with a gun, he couldn't possibly take down so many people. So he could only turn to look at George. Only George, with his magical abilities, could save him now. Chapter 40 George's Trump Card. George, naturally, heard the footsteps. After a moment's hesitation, he walked directly to the rooftop entrance, closed the iron door, and began casting a spell on the handle. Flavis, the transfiguration charm activated, and a fist-sized lock successfully materialized, firmly locking the iron door. He wasn't afraid of the ordinary people below, but having killed so many, he knew he'd inevitably leave traces. "Let's go." Having temporarily sealed off the rooftop and blocked his underlings from reaching it, George then cast the levitation charm on Leon. "You guard him, Leviosa." Leon was utterly shocked to see George's hands move in strange hand gestures before pointing at him, causing his body to float like a balloon. This was the first time he'd experienced something so miraculous, and his awe of George deepened. Grabbing the floating Leon by the shoulder, George leaped from the 6th-floor rooftop, simultaneously activating his ability, landing steadily in the dark alley. The levitation charm was one of the basic spells for first-year students, and one he had been focusing on studying and researching recently. Although he couldn't fly, he could use his magnetic powers to move larger objects, a decent control skill for combat, especially against the likes of X-24. A levitation spell to lighten X-24's weight, followed by magnetic power, would make it easy to manipulate. "Do you need my help later? You've already helped enough. I can handle the rest myself," Leon replied through gritted teeth. Chebble was dead. With his reputation and influence, turning the Chebble family into the Leon family wouldn't be difficult if he wanted to. As for Chebble's son, he was just a good-for-nothing who only knew how to eat, drink, and have fun. He didn't want to owe this mysterious man any more favors, knowing he'd have to repay them, and he still didn't know what the man wanted from him. Then get rid of the Chebble family as soon as possible. "Don't look for me, I'll come to you if I need anything." George nodded, then slowly rose and disappeared into the night sky. Having helped so much, if Leon still died, then this good-for-nothing wouldn't be suitable to be his agent. Meanwhile, in the Harry Potter world, Snape also had an opportunity to get closer to Snape, the first flying lesson after Charms class on Thursday afternoon of the second week. Snape, second only to Dumbledore in the school's elite warriors, possessed the legendary Spillblade, a magical version of the Six Meridians' divine sword. Once struck by Spillblade, due to its dark magic curse, it couldn't be healed with normal healing magic. Snape felt this professor was the one he most needed to cultivate a good relationship with, especially since he was in Slytherin. Therefore, besides grinding for points to win the House Cup for Slytherin, helping the Slytherin Quidditch team achieve victory was also one of his priorities. Quidditch, the most popular sport among wizards, could also help him improve his reputation among the students. The only drawback might be that it would waste his time learning charms. But after careful consideration, he felt it wasn't a waste. Practicing flying with a broomstick would allow him to better adapt to flying later, a skill he absolutely needed to master. Apparition is advantageous, but it can be interfered with by magic like anti-apparition. In special circumstances, flight is actually more convenient. As for why he was so confident in his Quidditch skills, he had never used a flying broomstick before, so he wasn't sure if this body had the talent for it. But that didn't matter. His physical strength already gave him an advantage, and more importantly, he had a trump card he had prepared long ago. First-year Slytherins had their flying lessons together with Gryffindors. At 3:30 p.m., the young wizards from both houses had already gathered on the lawn outside the castle. Among them, the children from wizarding families were excitedly talking about their thrilling experiences riding flying broomsticks. Most of them were boastful little stories, like racing eagles, flying across the sea to France, and almost crashing into Muggle planes. "George, I may not be as good as you in other subjects, but I won't let you get any more points in flying lessons." At this moment, Ginny led Colin to George, patting her chest with confidence. Seeing this, George laughed. "I've never ridden a flying broomstick before, so I probably won't get many points. Ginny definitely has a talent for flying broomsticks that's no less than Harry's," and when she was 6, she sneaked into the broomstick shed to steal her brother's broomsticks and rode them without ever being caught. However, this time, Ginny would probably be disappointed again. "Alright, children, now line up in 2 rows, I'll hand out the flying broomsticks." At this moment, Ms. Hooch, the teacher in charge of the flying class, dragged over 20 old, worn-out flying broomsticks over. So shabby, holding his own broomstick, George couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at the haphazardly protruding branches. These broomsticks were probably from the Sweeper series decades ago, their speed and performance far inferior to the Nimbus series of today. "Put your brooms on the ground first, then learn the spells to control them with me. Remember, the key is your belief. Don't be afraid, the less confident you are, the less they will respond to you." Ms. Hooch spent half an hour instructing the young wizards on the correct spells and techniques for using flying brooms, and then moved on to the practical stage. "Now, extend your right hand, place it above the broom handle, and begin chanting the spell." The young wizards did as instructed. Those young wizards with experience using flying brooms immediately had their brooms fly into their hands. However, those who were seeing flying brooms for the first time encountered various problems. Some brooms rolled on the ground and wouldn't get up, while others wobbled and fell back down after a short while. Some even lay there motionless, clearly having not chanted the spells correctly. "It doesn't seem too difficult." George stretched out his hand, and a flying broom instantly appeared in his hand, which surprised him. He guessed that it was probably not because his body itself had any high talent, but because his mental abilities greatly enhanced his mental strength, giving him a certain advantage in this aspect. In fact, it wasn't just a flying broomstick, his powerful mental abilities made him equally efficient at learning other spells. Sometimes he couldn't help but think that with his level 2 mental abilities already providing such a boost, how terrifying would Professor X's learning efficiency be if he had wizarding blood? Then he thought, if it were a phoenix harp, it wouldn't seem necessary. Her phoenix force was already one of the most terrifying powers. "Alright, now, let's try flying. When I whistle, you push off the ground with your legs, push hard." Seeing that everyone had successfully grasped their flying broomsticks after some attempts, Ms. Hooch moved on to the final stage of the lesson. At this moment, George also manipulated a thin wire, as thin as a hair, to emerge from his sleeve and wrap around the flying broomstick. Chapter 41: A once-in-a-millennium genius. Indeed, the wire was George's secret weapon for controlling his flying broomstick. The quality of a broomstick's flight depended primarily on the wizard's skill in manipulating it. Wrapping the broomstick with wire allowed him to use magnetism for more precise adjustments, in addition to magical control, a double guarantee. In reality, with his clone's weight of several dozen kilograms, he could fly using magnetism alone, just not as fast as the broomstick. He also used this technique on his wand, which had a wire loop at the end, allowing him to instantly recall it if it slipped from his hand. Hold the broomstick steady, rise a few feet, then lean forward slightly and land vertically. Listen to my whistle. 3, 2, 1, as Ms. Hooch's whistle rang out, the young wizards all kicked off and soared into the air on their broomsticks. However, most were unsteady in the air, carefully maintaining their balance, while some, like Ginny, flew very well and quickly due to their experience. Ginny, very good, excellent flight. Ginny's outstanding performance quickly caught Hooch's attention, and he couldn't help but praise her loudly, preparing to give Gryffindor extra points. However, he was soon interrupted by a chorus of exclamations. Turning her head to look at the Slytherin side on her right, an incredulous expression appeared on her face. "Oh, Merlin, that's a starfish hanging upside down, a Wallengan zigzag, a sloth rolling over a tree, a Lansky faint. This is impossible." What she saw was George, the star of Slytherin, who is now using high-difficulty Quidditch moves that only world-class Quidditch players could master. The starfish hanging upside down was a move only top-tier broomstick goalkeepers could perform. When the quaffle was about to enter but couldn't be stopped in time, the goalkeeper would immediately hang upside down on one leg on the broomstick, using their limbs to block the quaffle. The Wallengen zigzag was a superior technique where the chaser would move at high speed in a zigzag pattern to confuse the opposing chaser. The sloth-like roll is a high-difficulty move where, when the runner comes, the player hangs on the broomstick, gripping the handle tightly with both hands and feet, and rapidly spins the broomstick like a drill to deflect the runner. The Lansky feint involves the seeker pretending to see the snitch far below and rushing towards the ground, prompting the opposing seeker to imitate. However, the seeker stops their dive just before hitting the ground, leaving the opposing seeker no time to react and knocked unconscious. This move requires the seeker to have extreme control over the broomstick. Mastering just one of these 4 moves guarantees a spot on the national Quidditch team as seeker, chaser, beater, or goalkeeper. Even she couldn't perform all 4 moves smoothly, let alone with the school's sweep series broomsticks. These broomsticks are decades old, they're fine for casual use in class, but become uncontrollable at high speeds. Yet, look at George, not only can he control them, but he can also perform all 4 of these classic, high-difficulty moves. Slytherin gets 20 points. You can practice freely. George, come with me, Hooch shouted excitedly as George landed smoothly, pulling him towards the castle. Is this really your first time riding a flying broomstick? She asked incredulously as they walked. George nodded shyly, feigning shyness. I can't ride one where I live. But I've read some books and introductions about Quidditch. He knew his plan had succeeded. With his physical strength and the stable control of the magnetic broomstick, let alone the 4 moves he'd just performed, dancing ballet on the broomstick and doing a few Thomas flares would be no problem at all. Oh, you really? That's incredible. Hooch was almost incoherent upon hearing George's answer. In the Slytherin headmaster's office, Snape was sitting in his chair writing his research notes on newly created potions when he was suddenly startled by a rapid knocking. He frowned and waved his wand to open the door. Ms. Hooch, is something so important that you're in such a hurry? Seeing that the visitors were Hooch, the flying instructor, and her house's best student, he relaxed slightly. Hooch excitedly pushed George in front of Snape. Professor Snape, your Slytherin has produced a Quidditch prodigy, one in a millennium. You simply can't believe it. On his first time riding a broomstick, is all of this true? Hearing Hooch's words, even the usually expressionless Snape couldn't remain calm. As the head of Slytherin, he had a very deep affection for Slytherin House, and he still harbored resentment over Slytherin's loss to Gryffindor last year, especially with Harry's presence. If George truly possessed such a powerful broomstick talent, then Slytherin wouldn't lose again for the next 7 years. I'm not old enough to be blind, and many of your children saw it too. Hooch seemed somewhat annoyed by Snape's skepticism. Snape quickly said, I'm not questioning you, I'm just a little surprised. He turned to George, revealing a smile that was more like a grimace. George, you're very good, always have been. I'll personally arrange for you to join the Slytherin Quidditch team on Saturday. Gryffindor can make an exception, and so can we Slytherin. Professor, I don't really want to join the Quidditch team, George replied, feigning embarrassment. Hearing George's words, Hooch and Snape were both taken aback, then asked almost simultaneously, why? Joining the Quidditch team was every young wizard's dream, especially with George's tall flying broomstick. He was practically a born Quidditch player. George looked up at Snape and coughed. It's like this, because I prefer studying magic to Quidditch, especially defense against the dark arts. Professor Lockhart's defense against the dark arts class requires me to spend more time self-studying. But joining Quidditch means frequent training, which will leave me with less time. Sigh, self-study is really difficult, you have a point. Compared to Quidditch, learning magic is fundamental. Lockhart is indeed a fool. Snape fell into deep thought upon hearing this. In his mind, learning magic was definitely more important than Quidditch. He didn't have much interest in Quidditch, mainly because as head of the house, he naturally wanted Slytherin to win the Quidditch Cup. Here's what we'll do, you join the Slytherin team, and I'll try my best to prevent them from asking you to train. Every weekend, I'll dedicate half a day to tutoring you in defense against the dark arts. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 42. The most suitable is the strongest. If that's the case, then of course there's no problem. Hearing Snape's reply, George nodded without hesitation. He'd gone through all this trouble just for this purpose. Lockhart could only teach him the forgetfulness charm, everything else was a mess. For dark magic, he still needed Snape. And with one private lesson a week, it was practically like he was Snape's personal disciple. Over time, a bond might form, and becoming Snape's godfather wasn't out of the question. Shamelessness knows no bounds. To improve his strength, becoming Snape's godfather wasn't out of the question. Seeing George agree so readily, Snape was momentarily stunned, inexplicably feeling a bit tricked. But after thinking about it, it didn't seem important. His house had produced a genius, he was always willing to show him some favor. Having informed Snape, Hodge took George back to the lawn outside the castle. As soon as George returned, he was surrounded by the young wizards, asking what Lady Hodge had taken him to do. He didn't hide anything, saying he'd met with Headmaster Snape and been exceptionally admitted to the Slytherin Quidditch team, but didn't mention tutoring. This answer naturally caused a stir among the young wizards. The Slytherin wizards were immediately smug, while the Gryffindor wizards were somewhat dejected. I thought I could beat him in broomstick class, but I lost even in that, Ginny sighed, looking at George surrounded by others. Colin, however, wasn't discouraged at all, instead taking pictures. Well, he's George, and he really works hard. I heard he's always the last one to leave the common room every night, and he's our friend. You're right, at least it's George, not the others. Ginny smiled. George wasn't just slightly better than them, he was superior in every way, and so hardworking, it was hard to be jealous. After her flying lesson, watching George walk away with the other young wizards to the Great Hall, Madame Hooch put away all the flying brooms with her wand and murmured, "No, I have to talk to Bagman about this. Maybe we can turn around our position in international Quidditch all these years." Ludo Bagman, the current director of the Department of Magical Sports at the British Ministry of Magic, was also a Quidditch team senior she knew before retiring to teach at Hogwarts. In recent years, the English Quidditch team had almost been defeated repeatedly, nearly falling to the bottom of the international Quidditch rankings. If a once-in-a-millennium genius like George joined, perhaps they could change the English Quidditch team's current situation. As for George's young age and still in school, recently, a fifth-year student named Victor Krum from Durmstrang School of Witchcraft and Wizardry was exceptionally admitted to the Bulgarian Quidditch team because of his genius seeker talent. George could naturally do the same. She felt that George's talent in Quidditch was definitely superior to that of Victor Krum. George has joined the Slytherin team, which is perfect for Bagman to see this year's Quidditch match at Hogwarts. By evening, news of George's exceptional inclusion in the Slytherin team had spread throughout the school, including the impressive maneuvers he performed in flying class. Many young wizards who were passionate about Quidditch were quite familiar with those famous moves. This further enhanced George's reputation throughout Slytherin and the entire school. Older Slytherins spoke to him with more respect. Of course, not all Slytherins were happy about this, such as Malfoy, whose father had just spent a fortune to get him into the team. But obviously, he could do nothing but sulk. Saturday arrived quickly, and early that morning, Snape summoned George for tutoring. Tutoring every Saturday morning was something he had promised George. "I'm teaching you the repel spell now. It's a basic spell, but don't underestimate it. If used correctly, a basic spell can be more powerful than a higher level spell. Like this repel spell, if used well, it can even repel a fire dragon." Under Snape's strict but very detailed guidance, George truly gained a deeper understanding of dark magic and magical combat. He used to think that Avada Kedavra and Fiend Fire were the most powerful spells. One was a guaranteed death, and the other had a wide range that could even burn down an entire city. But through Snape's explanation, he realized that this wasn't the case. The most suitable spell for different situations and different enemies is the strongest spell. Sometimes Avada Kedavra and Fiend Fire might not be as effective as a basic spell. Against small and agile enemies, the Killing Curse simply wouldn't hit. A freezing spell with a wider range but less power would be needed. There are also magical creatures with extremely high magic resistance, like dragons. Even if they are hit by the Killing Curse or the Fiend Fire Curse, they are not seriously injured. On the contrary, the Eye Curse, which targets the eyes, is very effective. The same goes for the Repulsion Curse. because it uses magical power to create a forward physical pressure attack. Even those with high magic resistance cannot be immune. A repulsion curse used by a master like Dumbledore could actually knock a dragon away. In the afternoon, Snape personally brought George to the Quidditch pitch outside the castle. However, it seemed that there were not only the Slytherin team on the pitch, but also the Gryffindor team, and the situation was obviously not right. The Slytherin players were all laughing so hard that their captain, Flint, couldn't stand up straight and had to use his new broom to support himself. Malfoy was on all fours, pounding the ground with his fists. On the other side, the Gryffindor players were all gathered around Ron, along with Hermione and Colin, who was taking pictures with a camera. At this moment, Ron was constantly spitting out shiny slugs. "What happened?" Snape asked, his face grim. Upon seeing Snape, the Slytherin players immediately stood at attention, their captain Flint quickly saying, "Headmaster, I brought the note you gave me to the pitch, but wouldn't let me pass." Their second-year student, Ron Weasley, even took the opportunity to attack Malfoy, but he misused the spell, and it bounced back on himself. Today, the pitch belongs to the Slytherin team. Ron Weasley attacked a classmate with magic at school. Gryffindor loses 10 points. Snape issued the punishment expressionlessly, then, seeing Harry, who was in charge of Ron, immediately added with disgust, "Potter, you were right next to Ron, why didn't you stop him? Do you think his mistake makes you look good?" Gryffindor loses another 10 points. Harry, already resentful about Gryffindor losing points, was stunned by Snape's words. George couldn't help but twitch his lips. To be honest, he felt a little sorry for Harry. But what could he do? He wasn't Harry. Chapter 43 The Scheming Boy George. Professor Snape, we booked the entire Quidditch pitch long ago, and Ron attacked Malfoy because you called Hermione a mudblood. Faced with a formidable Snape, Wood and the others, though angry, dared not refute him. Harry, however, was unwilling to let it go. Snape's eyes hardened further. "You dare lie, Malfoy? You called Hermione a mudblood." George suddenly spoke up, asking Malfoy first. Malfoy, feeling emboldened by Snape's presence, proudly declared, "She is a mudblood. Hogwarts shouldn't accept mudbloods as students. Who Hogwarts accepts as students isn't up to you." Hearing Malfoy's words, Snape immediately turned and reprimanded him sternly. It's worth noting that his favorite witch, Harry's mother, Lily Evans, was also born into a Muggle family. George, having achieved his goal, quietly retreated. Malfoy, clearly startled by Snape's usual leniency, quickly shut his mouth. Snape looked at Harry again. "The point deduction is cancelled, but Potter, Gryffindor will lose 5 points for talking back to teacher." Harry wanted to argue, but Hermione grabbed his arm. "It was a 20-point deduction before, only 5 now, much better." Ugh, Ron spat out a bunch of slugs. Cut off curses, George stepped forward and waved his wand, a blue beam of magic striking Ron, instantly removing the slugs. Snape had mentioned during tutoring that if encountering an unknown anti-curse, one could try a common anti-curse charm first. It worked. "Thank you, George," Ron said, regaining his composure. Harry and Hermione nodded to George as well. They knew that if George hadn't spoken up, tricking Malfoy into revealing the truth, Gryffindor would have lost an extra 15 points. George blinked quietly, then retreated to Snape's side. "I want to try out the universal anti-healing spell I just learned," Snape said calmly. "George helps a classmate heal. Slytherin gets 5 points." The young wizards of the Slytherin team, whose heads had just drooped, raised them again. "All right, that's enough for now. The Slytherin team is going to train 2 new players, so you can leave." Hearing Snape's dismissal, Wood immediately led everyone away from the Quidditch pitch. However, after leaving the pitch, Harry, Ron, and Hermione quietly returned and hid in the stands, peeking over. They weren't trying to get information about the Slytherin team, they simply wanted to know who would be the new Seeker, George or Malfoy. They had learned from Ginny yesterday that George was going to join the Slytherin team. At that time, they assumed George would definitely be the Seeker, like Harry last year, but today they learned that Malfoy had already become the Seeker because his father had equipped everyone on the team with the latest Nimbus 2001. Therefore, they were worried that George's joining might not go smoothly. You all know about George. He can use the teaching broomstick to perform high-difficulty moves that even international Quidditch players find difficult. So I've decided that he will be the team's new Seeker. After Wood and the others left, Snape began announcing George's position on the team. Malfoy's expression immediately changed. "Headmaster, you promised Father I'd be the new Seeker. Drian Percy, like Terrence Higgs, will be leaving the team to focus on his studies. Malfoy, you'll be the new chaser, Snape replied without hesitation. This was an arrangement he'd planned the previous night. Young Malfoy did indeed possess considerable talent for flying broomsticks, and his father's generosity had greatly enhanced the Slytherin team's strength. Therefore, replacing Terrence Higgs, who was weaker than first-year Harry, with young Malfoy was perfectly reasonable and in Slytherin's best interest. Now that they had a broomstick prodigy like George, the most important seeker position naturally belonged to him. However, young Malfoy's contribution was also significant, so the dispensable chaser, Drian Percy, was replaced. Headmaster, I disagree. I want to be the seeker and compete with Potter, Malfoy immediately shouted. Now everyone knows he's going to be the seeker for the Slytherin team, and if George were to take his place, he'd be incredibly embarrassed. Besides, he's always wanted to outdo Harry, and only being a seeker himself gives him a chance. Headmaster, you know George is friends with Harry and has good relationships with the Gryffindors. If he's the seeker, he'll definitely go easy on Harry. Malfoy, do you think Slytherin wizards can't be friends with the Gryffindors? At this moment, George stepped in front of Malfoy. I think it's not just about friendship, if it's suitable, even marrying a Gryffindor, which isn't impossible. We're all Hogwarts wizards, so competition is normal, but it's a bit unreasonable to think we can't be friends or lovers just because we're from different houses. Who says only people from one house can be friends or marry? The rest of the Slytherin team were stunned by George's audacious statement. They were certain he would be severely reprimanded by Snape. Headmaster, see? I told you so. If George were the seeker, he'd definitely let Harry win. And he even wants to marry one of those Gryffindor mudbloods. A Slytherin wizard wanting to marry a Gryffindor wizard? That's the biggest joke I've heard all day. Shut up. Hang him upside down. Snape, his face grim, cast a spell and hung Malfoy upside down. Either be the chaser, or get out of the team, you little punk. Trying to mess with me. George's lips curled into a slight smile. He had deliberately said that to provoke Malfoy into uttering those words. Malfoy was unaware that Snape's greatest pain stemmed from being sorted into a different house, and from his Slytherin status, saying hurtful things that led to Lily being snatched away by Potter. Malfoy's words were a direct slap in the face to Snape. Headmaster, he said. Malfoy seems a bit unconvinced. How about this? Malfoy and I have a contest. Whoever catches the golden snitch first becomes Slytherin's seeker. He wanted to make Malfoy submit, ensuring he would never dare challenge him again, thus solidifying his own position within Slytherin. The bell falls. With a wave of his wand, Snape set Malfoy down. He had a close relationship with Malfoy's parents. They were both Death Eaters and classmates, and Snape had almost become Malfoy's godfather. So, if Malfoy hadn't kept hurting him today, he wouldn't have been so harsh on him. Alright, let's have a match. The winner becomes the seeker, the loser becomes the chaser. Chapter 44 Little Malfoy, in control. This is the golden snitch. When I release it, it will fly at high speed around the field, and whoever catches it first will be the team seeker. Captain Flint, who seemed to possess troll blood and was even taller than Snape, explained, holding a walnut-sized, golden metal ball with a pair of small silver wings. Alright, let's begin. Flint released his grip, and the golden snitch immediately flew off at incredible speed, with Malfoy and George following closely behind. The golden snitch was incredibly fast and agile. Even if you caught up, it could easily leave you behind with a single turn, just like Malfoy had just experienced. Because his broomstick accelerated too quickly, he couldn't break in time when the golden snitch turned and flew quite a distance before turning back. But George was different. As the golden snitch turned, he immediately controlled his broomstick to turn as well, the broomstick's inertia completely reversed by the magnetically controlled wire. After completely catching up with the golden snitch, George reached out and grabbed it with lightning speed. The golden snitch quickly dodged, but George's magnetic control kicked in again. Although the golden snitch was a magical artifact, it was still made of metal and was naturally affected by his magnetism. Directly stopping it would be too obvious, but slightly slowing it down was imperceptible. Because of George's magnetism, the golden snitch's reaction time was slowed by a second, and in that 1 second, George had firmly grasped it in his hand. So fast, less than a minute, Snape and his teammates below were startled to see the golden snitch caught by George. Although this wasn't a formal match, and there were no players from both teams or the interference of quaffles and blink balls, making it much easier to catch the golden snitch, Catching it in just 1 minute was still incredibly fast. It's worth noting that in previous Quidditch matches, the longest recorded time to catch the golden snitch was 3 months, demonstrating just how difficult it was to catch. Harry, if George becomes Slytherin's seeker, you're doomed. Of the three peeking, Ron looked at Harry sympathetically, who also wore a bitter expression. Hermione, however, said, but if George becomes the seeker, Malfoy will be furious. That doesn't seem so bad. Ron and Harry's eyes lit up, and they nodded in agreement. Seeing Malfoy get his comeuppance was certainly something that pleased them greatly. Lost, the two landed, and Malfoy, looking at the golden snitch in George's hand, deflated like a punctured balloon. From this day forward, he would become the laughingstock of Slytherin and utterly disappoint his father. His father had spent so much money to make him the seeker, someone who could compete with Harry, but he had lost it. Since you want to be the seeker so badly, then you be it, George said, handing the golden snitch back to Flint and looking at the dejected Malfoy. Malfoy instantly looked up at George with an incredulous expression. Snape and the others also looked at George with equal surprise, not understanding what he was up to. I think the seeker, chaser, beater, and goalkeeper are all equally important, and I'm confident I can win honor for Slytherin. But I just tried it out, and the seeker role seems a bit boring, not challenging enough. George shrugged, then looked at Malfoy with a half-smile, and I don't like to deprive others of their dreams. The other players' gazes towards George softened considerably. Thank you. Malfoy was silent for a few seconds, expressing his gratitude to George for the first time. He had previously disliked George because the latter had not only stolen all his thunder but also openly mocked him. But now, he suddenly felt that George wasn't so repulsive after all, and even felt a little grateful to him. After all, George was truly remarkable. In this situation, he was still willing to save face for him, allowing him to escape from a desperate situation. As fellow Slytherins, we should help each other and strive for Slytherin's honor, shouldn't we? George patted Malfoy on the shoulder, and this time Malfoy's face didn't show any resentment. Little Malfoy, easy to handle. That's how Slytherins are. If you're weak, no matter how much you try to please them, they'll just think you're easy to bully. But if you're strong enough, they'll admire you and be willing to follow you from the bottom of their hearts. Is Malfoy a heinous criminal? Of course not. He's just a somewhat proud kid, and his nature is actually kinder than his two lackeys. He deliberately suppressed them because they provoked him first. But if there's a chance to win them over, it wouldn't be bad. The Malfoy family is quite prestigious among purebloods, and there might be many things they can use before Voldemort's resurrection. As for the Seeker, Beater, Chaser, and Keeper, he really sees no difference. In fact, he thinks the Chaser is easier to improve his reputation than the Seeker. In a normal game, the Seeker is the one who receives the most attention. The game only ends when the Seeker catches the golden snitch, and the Seeker gains a full 150 points for the team. In most cases, unless the skill gap between the two teams is too large, the score difference won't be 150 points. Therefore, it's generally assumed that whichever team's Seeker catches the golden snitch wins. If, as the Chaser, he could raise the score to over 150 points before the Seeker catches the snitch, he would be even more dazzling than the Seeker. This is extremely rare in Hogwarts Quidditch history. Of course, what he did worked on the naive young Malfoy, but it wouldn't be effective against a seasoned veteran like the elder Malfoy. The elder Malfoy wasn't even particularly loyal to Voldemort. Well said. What Slytherin needs most is unity. Since George has voluntarily given up, then Malfoy will be the Seeker, and George will be the Chaser. Snape, unusually, revealed his smile, which was more like a grimace. As the head of Slytherin, seeing such a harmonious scene naturally pleased him greatly, and his evaluation of George rose to a new level. Such magnanimity and insight at his age was truly rare. If he had possessed George's magnanimity and insight back then, instead of spending all his time studying dark magic, that damned Potter wouldn't have been able to take advantage and steal Lily away. You all train hard, Snape said. After leaving, everyone began Quidditch training. George, as the new Chaser, showcased his superb skills as the Chaser. The Seeker catches the golden snitch, the goalkeeper guards the goal, the Beater hits the blink to disrupt the opposing team, and the Chaser steals the quaffle and shoots it. This shot can be done with hands, feet, or even a flying broomstick, anything without magic. George's physical abilities were comparable to Captain Flint, who had troll blood. But he was much more agile, and possessed absolute control over his flying broomstick. So basically, From stealing the ball to dodging to shooting, it's all done in one smooth motion. Chapter 45, The Roaring Letter to Leon. After joining the Slytherin team, George's life gradually settled down. His daily routine consisted of collecting points, studying and researching magic, browsing the library to improve his understanding of magic, and constantly seeking help from his teachers. As for Quidditch training, Snape allowed him to skip it due to his superior skills. As time went by, his magical knowledge and skill level increased rapidly. He had almost mastered the first-year spells and began learning second-year material ahead of time. 2 months passed quickly, and October arrived. The weather began to turn cold, and many young wizards caught colds. Fortunately, the school nurse, Madame Pomfrey, had created a stimulant that would make his ears smoke for several hours after drinking it, but the effect was immediate and easily cured his cold. George sat by the window in the library, quietly reading. A light rain was falling outside, and occasionally, young witches would peek up at him from inside the library. Thanks to the lavish meals at Hogwarts over the past few months, he was no longer the frail boy he once was. "It's time. You can go back now," said the thin, elderly librarian, Mrs. Pants, rising to address the young wizards still reading in the library. George checked the time. It was already 8 p.m., the library's closing time. He checked out the books he hadn't finished reading and left the library, intending to return to the Slytherin common room to continue reading. Meanwhile, in the Marvel Universe, it was 8 a.m., and George's true form was already riding his motorcycle towards the Bronx. Tony Stark had been kidnapped for almost 3 months and was expected to escape soon. In the past 3 months, Lion had completely transformed the Chebbles family into the Lion family. Therefore, the previous plan needed to be put into action. In fact, due to the previous car purchase and the lavish meals over the past few months, Gabriella and Wolverine's savings were almost depleted. He genuinely needed money, and the children desperately needed to go to school. These laboratory children were being trained from a young age to be assassins. They had never received a normal education and were severely lacking in common sense. Gabriella is just an ordinary nurse with limited education. Isa is a driver with little formal education and is currently learning to fly a plane. Wolverine is good at teaching combat and history, but not much else. Caliban originally started his black market business because of his lack of education. The most well-rounded is Professor X, who graduated from Harvard University at 16 and also attended Oxford and Columbia universities, earning multiple doctorates in biology, psychology, and other fields. However, he has poor health, needs to take medication frequently, and spends most of his time in an EEG room to prevent sudden seizures. On the rooftop of the former ballroom in the Bronx, George took out an ordinary letter, placed it on the ground, and then rapidly waved his hands to begin casting a spell. After the magic was imprinted on the envelope, he picked it up and typed in his message. Indeed, he was creating a roaring letter. He wasn't spending all his time in the library for nothing. Besides studying magic, he also spent time learning alchemy, that is, how to create magical items. He couldn't possibly master complex magical items like wands, flying brooms, magical cars, and door keys so quickly. But simple items like howling letters were easy for him to make. After crafting a howling letter, he attached a pin to it and waited quietly on the rooftop. About half an hour later, a smug Leon, cigar in hand, emerged from the dance hall with a group of henchmen and got into the extended Lincoln parked outside. At that moment, George activated his ability to control the pin, sending the howling letter flying off the rooftop and sliding into the car just as the doors were closing. He had thought things through carefully during this time. He decided to be cautious with people like Leon who operated in the underworld, at least until Leon's abilities allowed him to ignore modern firearms. Therefore, if possible, he should avoid frequent contact and maintain an air of mystery. The unknown is often the most terrifying. This way, even if Leon faced a threat in the future, as long as it wasn't fatal, he shouldn't dare betray him. Because he was too mysterious in Leon's eyes, betraying him would likely result in terrible retribution, so this was a safer option. A letter. Leon was about to close the door when a letter squeezed through the gap in the car and landed on his lap, leaving him somewhat bewildered. However, upon seeing the name on the envelope, his pupils instantly contracted, and he quickly opened the door and peeked outside. "Sir, what's wrong?" the driver asked, puzzled. Leon looked around and saw only his men. There was no one else. He took a deep breath, got back into the car, and instructed, "Nothing, get out and wait for me." I want to be alone in the car." The driver, though confused, obediently got out. Leon picked up the letter. The envelope contained only one word: death. 2 months ago, he was almost killed, and a mysterious man called Death saved him. Now he had finally cleared all obstacles, including the remnants of Chebel's son, Little Chebel, completely transforming the Chebel family into the Lion family. He had also become one of the 13 most powerful figures in the Bronx underworld. However, the Grim Reaper had still not appeared, which had become a source of anxiety for him. On one hand, he was genuinely grateful for the other's life-saving grace and wanted to repay it. On the other hand, he was also very wary of this mysterious figure who could kill Chebel so easily. Because that meant that killing him would be just as simple. This was one of the reasons why he always went out with a group of henchmen. That's how people are. When they were henchmen, they don't think so much and aren't so afraid of death. But when they become bosses, when they become the ones in power, they start to think a lot more and begin to fear death. He picked up the envelope and carefully opened it, but to his surprise, the envelope was empty. There was no letter inside. But the next second, he opened his mouth in astonishment and froze on the spot. The envelope suddenly flew out of his hand, floated in the air, and transformed into a mouth that spoke. "Leon, wait for me alone on the rooftop at midnight tonight." Then, the mouth bit itself into a pile of fragments and fell to the ground. It took Leon a full 10 seconds to react, then he took a deep breath and murmured, "What kind of being is this? Is he a god, or truly a demon from hell?" He then remembered the wish he had made before dying on the rooftop and couldn't help but shudder. Chapter 46: The Carlson Family's Doom. At midnight, Leon walked alone onto the rooftop. The moon was full tonight, and its bright light bathed the rooftop, slightly easing his tense nerves. Facing someone who could kill him at any moment, even though he knew the other party was unlikely to kill him, otherwise, there would be no need to go to such lengths to save him, he still felt a tremor of fear. "You're here," a familiar voice rang out, and he looked up in the direction of the voice. George, wearing a Grim Reaper mask, had appeared above him, slowly descending through the moonlight, a sight that resembled that of a god. "Mr. Grim Reaper, what are your orders?" Leon instinctively bowed. George landed and looked Leon up and down before saying, "If I kill all the leaders of the other 12 families in the Bronx, can you take over all their territories?" He thought for a moment. Cash alone wasn't enough. If he cooperated with Leon to take over the entire Bronx underworld, they could split the spoils. That would be a truly big heist, and he wouldn't have to worry about money anymore. Whether the Bronx becomes better or worse after Leon takes control of the entire Bronx underworld is none of his business. Frankly, the hardships and struggles of the people there are none of his concern. He's not a superhero constantly thinking about saving people and helping all living beings. He's lucky if he can even save himself. What? Leon's legs went weak at the words, and he almost collapsed to the ground in shock. He hadn't expected George's first words to be so forceful. He'd only just transformed the Chebel's family into the Leon family, and now he was being asked to take over the entire Bronx underworld. None of those 12 families were easy to deal with. However, when he saw the seriousness in George's eyes and realized he wasn't joking, he couldn't help but swallow hard. To be honest, it was incredibly tempting, but in the end, he shook his head with a wry smile. "Impossible. With my strength, I can't handle so many families. Even if I could, I can't." "Why?" George raised an eyebrow. He could understand the former, but what did the latter mean? Fearing to anger George, Leon quickly explained, "You might not know, but the reason there are 13 families in the Bronx is because Kingpin, the king of the American underworld, decided this. Even if you kill all 12 families, I can't take over all their territory. In the end, a new set of 12 families will replace the previous ones. Kingpin won't allow any family in the Bronx to threaten his position." "Kingpin, what if you kill him?" George frowned slightly. He knew Kingpin, but he hadn't realized Kingpin's influence in the underworld was so great, even controlling the number of families in the Bronx. However, Kingpin was still just an ordinary person. Even though his physical strength was close to the human limit, killing him wouldn't be too difficult for him. The main challenge was finding him. Hearing George say that killing Kingpin was as easy as killing a chicken, Leon couldn't help but gasp. Even if you kill Kingpin, it won't work. This isn't that simple. If Kingpin dies, the entire underworld will be in chaos. The major families will inevitably start fighting, not just in the Bronx, but also in other, more powerful families. With my strength, I can't protect the entire Bronx. and even my current territory might be threatened. Then forget it. George felt Leon's words made sense. Unless he wiped out the entire American underworld, Leon might be killed while he was away. Besides, he didn't have the time or energy to do that, and doing so would inevitably attract the attention of major organizations, which would contradict his original intentions. Making money was only to have more time to focus on magic research. Spending a lot of time and energy cleaning up the underworld would be putting the cart before the horse. Then how about we just deal with one family and then take over their territory and assets? Is that alright? George asked again. This time, Lion didn't immediately refuse. Instead, he pondered for a few seconds before replying, if it's just one family, that's fine. I'll allocate some resources to support a smaller family. As long as the total number of 13 families remains the same, Kingpin will at most send someone to reprimand them. This kind of thing wasn't uncommon in the Bronx. The 13 families jointly managed the Bronx, and it was not uncommon for them to fight each other for profits. It wasn't unusual for a smaller family to defeat a larger one and rise to power. Kingpin always welcomed such conflicts. On the contrary, he didn't want to see the 13 families united. Alright, then you provide a family that's at odds with you. I'll have their leadership die unexpectedly in the next few days. Then you take their territory, and we'll split the profits 50-50, George nodded. Since he couldn't wipe out all 12 families, eliminating one and taking all the profits would definitely yield a substantial amount. At least it should be more than his previous plan of simply robbing the 12 families of their cash. The Carlson family, their territory is right next to ours, and they often clash with us. This time, while I was fighting with Chebel Jr., they seized a lot of our land. I was originally planning to fight them and take it back. If their leadership suddenly dies, I'm confident I can take over all their territory. Leon's expression became somewhat excited. He wouldn't object to splitting the spoils 50-50, or even giving it all to George. George had indeed saved his life, and the Carlson family had taken advantage of his misfortune, killing several of his close brothers. He hadn't intended to let them off the hook. However, after the internal strife, his strength was considerably weaker than before. He certainly couldn't win a fight. At most he could annoy them. But now it was different. This mysterious Grim Reaper was willing to intervene, so revenge was definitely possible. Gather the information on this family. I'll come back for it tomorrow night. After leaving these words, George leaped off the rooftop and disappeared into the darkness. Although it deviated somewhat from his original plan, the result wasn't too bad. He wasn't a god. He couldn't possibly predict everything. Even with his intelligence advantages, mistakes were inevitable. However, he considered this normal. If plans changed, he would devise new ones. The important thing was to have the ability to calmly adapt to changes while still successfully achieving his goals. Ultimately, strength was the key. With strength, even if the world descended into chaos completely outside the storylines he knew, it wouldn't be a big deal. Chapter 47: The combination of mental abilities and the legitimacy spell. It seems we can't give up on the Tony Stark storyline. After leaving the rooftop, George didn't return to school. Instead, he rode his beloved motorcycle straight to Manhattan, determined to find time to go to the Middle East to rescue Tony. He had previously considered that taking Wolverine to rescue Tony might attract Shield's attention, and he figured it was better to rely on himself than others. So, he decided to find an agent, plunder all the families in the Bronx, and then invest in Stark stock to make a fortune. But now the situation had changed, and after careful consideration, he realized a problem he had previously overlooked. Could Tony Stark really escape on his own? In the cinematic universe, that would be no problem, but this wasn't. There were Wolverine and Professor X, and other mutants. It was unclear which Marvel universe this was from. What if Tony Stark failed to escape and died in that cave? He'd lose everything. How could he guarantee that buying Stark stock would be a sure thing? He felt the safest course of action was for him to personally travel to the Middle East, rescue Tony Stark, and then immediately have Leon use all his cash to buy Stark stock. He had also considered the possibility of being discovered by Shield. He was no longer the same person he was before, only knowing the lockpicking charm, with limited abilities in a group of burdensome rookies. Now, he had Leon, the head of one of the 13 Bronx families, as a partner, who could easily provide him with a real identity as a disguise. His magnetism had been developed to the point where he could deflect sniper bullets for long-range kills, and he had mastered all the spells from his first year as well as some spells outside the textbook. Therefore, he could completely and quietly go to the Middle East alone to rescue Tony Stark without being discovered. If possible, he could even secretly cooperate with Tony Stark, giving him partners in both the legitimate and underworld, making many things much easier in the future. Tony isn't that easy to kill. The military hasn't given up the search for him yet. And even if something really happened to Tony, Stark Industries has the world's best engineers, and our weapons are still the best in the world. So don't worry about Stark Industries' future, trust us. In New York's most upscale banquet hall, Obadiah Stanislav stood on the stage, eloquently trying to salvage Stark Industries' stock price. After the banquet, as he rode in his bodyguard's limousine to his Long Island villa, he couldn't help but curse, "These damn short-sighted bastards. Do they really think that without Tony Stark, the company can't develop better weapons?" He knew that if something happened to Tony Stark, the company's stock price would plummet, but he hadn't expected it to drop so much. If he didn't salvage the stock price, even if Tony really died and Stark Industries was completely under his control, it would shrink significantly. And those 10 Rings bastards, I'll wipe them all out sooner or later. How dare they blackmail me? The attack on Tony Stark in the Middle East was orchestrated by the 10 Rings, a terrorist organization he hired to eliminate Stark and seize control of the Stark Industries. But the 10 Rings recognized Tony Stark and immediately demanded an exorbitant price, one that even he couldn't afford. "Have you found the 10 Rings location, boss? We can only pinpoint it to the desert near Baghlan province in Afghanistan, but finding their exact location in that desert will take another 2 weeks," the bodyguard driving the car replied. "Once you confirm the location, send men there to take out Tony and those 10 Rings bastards." Obadiah Stanislav's eyes were filled with a sinister glint. Daring to threaten him? They'd rather die. "All right, here's the job." High in the sky, George spotted Obadiah Stanislav's car approaching through his binoculars. He quickly landed beside the road and began chanting a spell. Quickly soften. A blue magical beam struck the ground, causing the previously hard surface to soften and collapse. Obadiah Stanislav's speeding car was thrown off course by the collapse, crashing onto the side of the road and sliding a considerable distance. After several days of investigation, he knew this road was essentially Obadiah Stanislav's usual route home, so he had been staking out this spot. Why not stake out his house? Mainly because he wanted to stage a car accident to get Obadiah Stanislav hospitalized, which would further lower Stark Industries' stock price. Secondly, Obadiah Stanislav's villa had many bodyguards, making it difficult to gather information undetected. Reaching the overturned car, George saw Obadiah and his bodyguard inside, both clearly seriously injured, struggling to unbuckle their seatbelts and crawl out. "Good evening, Mr. Obadiah." George crouched on the ground, smiling and waving to the two inside. The bodyguard, highly alert, immediately abandoned unbucklers and drew his pistol, ready to shoot George. However, George was prepared, having already begun casting magic on his way. Conviction. A beam of blue magic struck the bodyguard before he could react, and the bodyguards he had lulled to the side, unconscious. Obadiah's pupils constricted upon seeing this, and he quickly said, "Whoever orders you to kill me, I'll pay you 10 times more." "That sounds tempting, but I'm not here to kill you." George smiled at Obadiah, activating his psychic abilities while casting a spell, Leech of Mind. A month ago, he had already consulted Snape, the master of Leech of Mind, about the spell, but Snape had refused to teach him, believing he was too young to learn it. Moreover, such a high-level spell was beyond his current capabilities. To learn the spell, he lied, claiming to be a natural Leech of Mind, able to read minds unsuspecting and communicate with magical creatures, thus wanting to learn the spell early to better control his abilities. After some verification, confirming he seemed to be a natural Leech of Mind, Snape finally agreed to teach him the Leech of Mind spell. Although after a month of practice, he could only use the spell rudimentarily, but combined with his level 2 psychic abilities, he could already forcibly read a person's mind. Especially when he was terrified. "Tell me, where is Tony Stark?" 2 sharp blades flew from George's sleeve, hovering between Obadiah's eyes. "Otherwise, you'll soon lose your eyes, then your ears, and finally your life." Chapter 48 8 Tracking Curses. I don't know what you're talking about. How would I know where Tony is? If I knew, I would have sent someone to rescue him. His disappearance caused the group's stock to plummet, Obadiah explained with a terrified expression, his tone and demeanor flawless. If George hadn't been using both legilimency and telepathy to read Obadiah's thoughts, he would have been completely fooled. To act so convincingly even with his life threatened, this guy was no pushover. And indeed, if he were, he wouldn't have outmaneuvered Tony so easily and wiped out the 10 rings. In the desert near Baghlan province in Afghanistan. It seems you don't know the exact location either. Stopping legilimency and telepathy, George frowned. He had assumed Obadiah would know the location of the 10 rings hideout, but it seemed the other had been searching as well, and only found a general outline. How do you know? Obadiah was completely dumbfounded by George's words. George, too lazy to explain further, raised his hand and began casting a spell on Obadiah, Ephemeral Oblivion. This was the only spell he had learned from Lockhart in the past 3 months. Although he couldn't use it as powerfully as Lockhart, he could still easily erase a small portion of an ordinary person's memory. After casting the Obadiah Oblivion spell, he cast it on the unconscious bodyguard as well. Having done this, he rode away on his motorcycle, which was already parked by the roadside. Shortly after George left, the bodyguard and Obadiah slowly woke up, but they only remembered that they had overturned their car and then passed out. They had no memory of George whatsoever. Damn it, I'm firing you, you piece of trash. Quickly call someone to rescue us, and immediately block the news. We can't let the outside world know I was in a car accident. The next day, news of Obadiah's car accident and injuries was reported by the all-powerful New York reporters. Of course, these reporters also had to thank a certain kind person who had placed this explosive news on their desks. With CEO Tony Stark missing and key figure Obadiah injured in a car accident, Stark Industries' stock price plummeted. However, for the world's largest corporation, these events, while impactful, weren't fatal. It was merely a matter of making a little more or a little less profit. Such a vast desert, finding someone won't be easy. At the entrance to Hogwarts Castle, George looked at the falling snowflakes, pondered for a moment, then turned and walked towards the Defense Against the Dark Arts office. Looks like I'll have to check the forbidden section. Finding Tony Stark's trail in the desert, even though it wasn't very large, was still no easy task. Therefore, he needed a spell that could locate him. He hadn't seen this spell on the regular shelves of the library, so he had to check the forbidden section. Normally, many wizarding spells are inspired by the abilities of magical creatures, like the legilimency charm, which was developed based on the legilimency abilities of cats and leopards. He couldn't believe that no wizard hadn't developed the owl's amazing tracking magic, especially since he remembered Newt was quite skilled at it and could even materialize scenes from past events. Tonks had also mentioned during a meal that he was practicing a tracking charm specifically for hunting down criminal dark wizards. However, if there's a tracking charm, there must be an anti-tracking charm. He remembered Sirius Black was proficient in anti-tracking charms, Aurors couldn't pinpoint his location, and even owls could block it. But people in the Marvel Universe don't know anti-tracking charms. If he could master one, he could quickly find Tony Stark in the desert. Entering the Forbidden Library required a teacher's permission, and other teachers, even Snape who currently valued him most, wouldn't grant him permission. After all, it contained too much dangerous dark magic and dangerous magical knowledge. Being too greedy could lead him astray and harm himself. Therefore, he could only go to Lockhart, the teacher who could easily obtain permission with just a few flattering words. Sure enough, thanks to the deliberate effort he'd put into building a closer relationship over the past few months, he obtained permission to enter the Forbidden Library almost effortlessly. Go ahead, but don't disturb the precious spellbooks inside, or I won't let you off the hook. Mrs. Pants glanced at Lockhart's permission slip in George's hand, frowned, gave a warning, and then led him into the Forbidden Library. Compared to the thousands of spellbooks outside, the Forbidden Library had far fewer books, but they were arranged much more neatly, clearly indicating that few people came to look at them. George skipped over the books containing alluring dark magic and began searching for spellbooks that recorded tracking magic. It wasn't that he didn't want to look, it was just that the instant he entered the Forbidden Library, his telepathic abilities told him that someone was secretly watching him. If he wasn't mistaken, the person watching him was most likely Dumbledore, perhaps using some kind of magic he didn't recognize, or a magical artifact. Ever since Voldemort found information about Horcruxes in the Forbidden Library, Dumbledore had paid extra attention to it, implementing surveillance measures to prevent similar incidents from happening again, which was understandable. As long as he doesn't touch dangerous dark magic books, there shouldn't be a big problem. After learning tracking spells, He can easily use excuses like searching for his biological parents to get away with it. He can always learn those dark magic spells in the forbidden section when Dumbledore isn't at school. Found it. After some searching, he actually found a magic book called 8 Ways to Find a Lost Person. He flipped through it and found it contained 8 different tracking spells. Some spells created arrows pointing in the direction of the target, some created footprints, and some, like Newt's, were advanced enough to reveal the target's silhouette. The most powerful was a time manipulation spell that could reverse time and allow him to see past events, thus knowing everything the target had done. However, since its creation, no wizard has been recorded as having mastered this spell. At George's current level, advanced tracking spells were out of the question. He only needed to learn the simplest one, the one with arrows pointing in the direction of the target. There were no buildings obstructing his view in the desert, and the arrow-guided tracking spell would be enough to find Tony Stark. He left the restricted area with a book on tracking charms, registered with Mrs. Pants, and returned to the Slytherin common room to begin studying the simplest type of tracking charm. Meanwhile, in the main Marvel universe, the purge of the Carlson family's upper echelons began. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 49, Murder or Accident? Nighttime, in the most luxurious nightclub within the Carlson family's territory in the Bronx. Deafening music, men and women dancing wildly, explicit and seductive performances on stage, and drug addicts in the corners, high on various contraband. George sat at the bar, ordering a drink, casually sipping it while searching for his target. According to the intelligence Lane had provided, this nightclub, controlled by the Carlson family, was now managed by Carlson's youngest son, Carlson Jr., who frequented it almost every night. Carlson Jr.'s greatest passion was women, especially young, vibrant women, preferably those yet to enter the workforce or only recently. With his status, he could easily afford to hire numerous young, energetic female college students, but he craved the feeling of conquest. Therefore, his daily visits to his nightclub were also for hunting prey. Once he found a target, he would have his men forcibly bring her back to his private room in the nightclub. If he was very satisfied, he would take matters into his own hands. In one of the most outrageous incidents, a performance was staged right in the middle of the nightclub, in full view of everyone. Afterwards, as heirs to the Carlson family, they could be bribed and threatened. Girls from ordinary families with no connections had no choice but to swallow their anger for their own and their family's safety. If they dared to resist, they'd simply be drowned. Even those with some influence wouldn't dare confront the Carlson family directly. Those whom even the Carlson family couldn't afford to offend knew what kind of nightclub it was and wouldn't go there. Those who frequented the nightclub were either seasoned veterans, the kind who came to party, or young people unaware of its operations. They were too naive and foolish. Some were curious, others hoped to find love, meet a tall, handsome, and rich man, and have a wonderful night. However, harsh reality would teach them a lesson, making them understand that staying away from danger was the best protection for themselves. They're here, seeing a burly, bald man enter the nightclub with a group of henchmen and brazenly sit in a luxurious private booth. George slowly stood up. Killing Carlson Jr. would be easy. He could simply control the blade and slit Carlson's throat with a single stroke. But that wasn't what he wanted. It would create chaos, and if things went wrong, the Carlson family's higher-ranking members would be scared into hiding, making things much more complicated. Moreover, the successive assassinations of higher-ranking members of the 13 families would also cause a sensation. Therefore, if possible, it was best not to be so direct, to make the deaths of these higher-ranking members seem like accidents. That was the result he wanted. He didn't want people to associate this with superpowers. Even when he saved Leon last time, everyone thought Leon had killed Chedball on the rooftop himself, not that George had helped him. Looks like I'm in luck today. Found a gem. Carlson Jr. had only been sitting for a short time when he found a satisfactory prey in the central dance floor. She was good-looking, tall, and most importantly, had a certain air about her, clearly a newbie, too shy to dance freely. Probably still a student. Boss, she looks like she's leaving. Should we just go over and kidnap her? A quick-witted underling asked. However, Carlson put down his glass and waved his hand. This time I want to go myself. She reminds me of that girl from last time. It's a pity she committed suicide, otherwise we could have come a few more times. Looks like the boss is planning to." Hearing Carlson's words, the underlings became excited. Like boss, like underlings, they were all cut from the same cloth. Carlson got up and strode onto the dance floor, stopping the girl before she could leave in the noisy space. He started with some verbal harassment, then began to grope her. The girl tried to resist, but she was no match for the tall Carlson, and his threats terrified her. As for her companion, she was already surrounded and immobilized by Carlson's men. Just as Carlson was about to succeed, George, in the crowd, moved to the closest position to him. Tarantella dance, a thin beam of blue light, seemingly imperceptible, struck Carlson in the brightly lit dance floor. Struck by the light, Carlson abruptly stopped his groping, his legs beginning to twitch uncontrollably, as if he were performing a very difficult fast-paced dance. His henchmen, seeing their boss suddenly start dancing, assumed he had some new trick up his sleeve and cheered loudly for his performance. The girl whose clothes were half-ripped was stunned, wondering why this bully had suddenly started dancing. Even more bewildered was Carlson himself, as he had no idea why he had suddenly started dancing. Legs freeze, the dancing spell was followed by a leg-locking spell, and Carlson, as if he had accidentally tripped while dancing, lost his balance and fell backward. If it were just a fall, that would be nothing. The crucial point was that at the moment he fell, a nail on a nearby thug wearing a studded leather jacket suddenly broke off and fell to the ground, rolling precisely where Carlson had fallen. Screech, the nail, pointing upwards, pierced Carlson's skull, causing him to bleed profusely and die instantly. "Someone's dead. Someone's dead," screams erupted across the dance floor as people scattered and fled. George quietly left the nightclub with the crowd. The nail wasn't an accident, it was under his control. 2 hours later, the grief-stricken old Carlson listened to his subordinates' report in the dance hall. Through surveillance and investigation, it's confirmed that this was indeed an accident, not a deliberate murder. "I told him long ago to be more restrained, but he wouldn't listen. He deserves it. Throw all those men protecting him into the sea to feed the fish." Confirming that his son hadn't been murdered but died in an accident, old Carlson sighed, leaned on his cane, and left the nightclub. His son's death grieved him, but what troubled him even more was the repercussions of his heir's passing. His son had been the heir, the family elders were willing to support him, and they had recently acquired some territory from the Chebel family. Everything was progressing well. But now that his sole heir was dead, the family elders would undoubtedly be restless. If he didn't handle things properly, the entire family could descend into chaos. Everyone would be vying for his position, making it 10 times more chaotic than the Chebel family situation. One wrong move, and he could lose everything. "My health is still pretty good, I can handle it. It seems I need to quickly identify a new heir." Chapter 50 Journey to Afghanistan. The next day, dark clouds loomed, and a light rain blanketed New York City. In a prestigious cemetery in the Bronx, old Carlson, leaning on his cane, gazed at his son's tombstone. A profound sadness welled up within him, a parent burying their child, and even his fierce face couldn't hold back a few tears. "Let's go. There are more important things to do today." Old Carlson wiped away his tears and, escorted by his henchmen, turned and walked out of the cemetery. Not far from them, in front of another tombstone, George was casting a spell. Black Mamba. As the incantation was complete, a gray-black mamba snake appeared before him, then quickly darted into the grass and slithered towards old Carlson's location. About a minute later, George heard old Carlson scream and the panicked cries of his henchmen. The nearest hospital was 30 minutes away, and given old Carlson's physical condition, he wouldn't survive more than 15 minutes after being bitten by the black mamba. With old Carlson dead, the Carlson family will inevitably descend into chaos. The higher-ups, vying for the leadership, will naturally take action, allowing him to fish in the confusion and eliminate most of the higher-ups. Even if sniper rifles are used, no one will suspect a thing. They'll simply assume the higher-ups hired each other to carry out the attack. 3 days later, at night, on the rooftop. The Carlson family's internal strife these past few days has severely weakened them. "I plan to make my move tomorrow and take over all their territory," Lyon said respectfully to George. He was deeply shocked that George had managed to dismantle the Carlson family, one of the 13 families, in just a few days. While the later assassinations weren't so bad, the initial accidental deaths of Carlson and his son had truly frightened him. Even knowing George was behind it, there were no signs of foul play. Everyone assumed the Carlsons were simply unlucky. One accidentally fell to his death, the other was bitten by a snake and died from its venom. Sometimes he wondered if George wanted to kill him. Would he, like the Carlson father and son, die unexpectedly in some accident? It was terrifying, like Satan taking your soul, and no matter how you resist, you can't escape it. Therefore, his awe of George deepened. Where should I transfer the money to? No need to transfer it to me, keep it in your account. I'll take it from you when I need it. George nodded in reply. He didn't have an account and couldn't transfer money. Transferring it to Wolverine and Gabriella's accounts would easily expose his identity. It was better to keep it with Leon, withdrawing cash when needed and having Leon pay for larger sums directly. He believed that after all this, Leon wouldn't dare to covet his money. By the way, after taking over Carlson's territory, try to liquidate as much cash as possible. If necessary, mortgage everything you can to get a loan from the bank, then wait for my call. Huh? Hearing George's words, Leon was stunned, clearly not understanding what was going on. George didn't explain much, simply saying, if you trust me, do as I say, and you can make a fortune. If you don't, I won't force you, just use all my share to buy Stark Industries stock. There was no need to tell Leon about his plan to rescue Tony Stark, saying too much would only make things worse. Ultimately, as long as he made money, Leon would naturally trust him more and more. I believe you. I absolutely believe you, Leon immediately replied, patting his chest. This wasn't because he was afraid of George's insincere words, but because he genuinely believed in the various amazing abilities George had demonstrated. He felt that perhaps George had the ability to predict the future, knowing that Stark Industries stock might surge, which was why he was urging him to buy quickly. If that were true, then he would truly make a fortune, even more than he would have made by acquiring the Carlson family. Don't be fooled by their status as one of the 13 families of the Bronx, seemingly powerful in the area. Compared to the world-class behemoth that was Stark Industries, they were like ants compared to an elephant. It's important to understand that the Bronx is merely one of the poorest and most chaotic boroughs in New York, while Stark Industries is one of the wealthiest corporations on Earth. A day later, the newly risen Leon family of the Bronx mobilized its entire force, sweeping away the Carlson family, whose power had plummeted due to internal strife, and seizing 80% of their territory, leaving only 20% for the last surviving member of the Carlson family. 2 days later, Leon frantically raised funds, even mortgaging his extended Lincoln limousine to the bank, demonstrating his unwavering determination and trust in George. 3 days later, the X-Force's training ground slowly opened, and a stealth fighter jet took off, heading towards Baghlan province in Afghanistan. Wolverine wasn't on the X-Force, only George and Isa, the pilot, were aboard. George had originally planned to have Leon send someone to Afghanistan, but when he returned to the school to discuss it with Professor X and the others, Isa said she could already pilot the X-Force smoothly. It was Professor X who had provided Isa with some professional guidance when he wasn't having an episode. Since Isa could pilot the X-Force to take him to Afghanistan, that was naturally the best option. The jet could fly directly to the desert, saving time and eliminating the risk of revealing his identity through transfers. As for why he didn't bring Wolverine to help, mainly because he was now strong enough to handle the Ten Rings terrorists, and Wolverine was, after all, a notorious figure. Tony should be able to recognize him. Even if he didn't, Jarvis could easily find out once they got back. He didn't want Tony to know his identity yet. The more people knew, the greater the risk of exposure. Even if it was Iron Man, he still needed to be cautious. In 2 more years, his strength would be even greater. Professor X and Wolverine would have regained their powers, and the mutant children would be able to skillfully use their abilities in combat, so he wouldn't need to be as careful as he was now. The X-Force was very fast, and in just a few hours, it flew over the desert outside Baghlan province in Afghanistan. Direction manifestation. As George's incantation rang out, an arrow made of golden powder appeared in front of him. Moreover, the arrow would change direction as Aisha moved the jet. However, this arrow can only indicate the cardinal directions on a flat plane, not up or down. It's fine for finding people in the desert, but not so convenient in the city. Because cities have tall buildings, if the person you're looking for is on the 18th floor and you're on the 1st, no matter how the arrow points, you won't find them. This kind of tracking spell isn't suitable for complex terrain. For complex terrain, you need a better one that can show movement traces, but he hasn't learned that yet. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.